Hello there and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable if you can. Maybe you're already under a blanket. Maybe you have a drink nearby. Maybe you're listening with one ear while the room around you gets quieter. Tonight we're going somewhere that history often shows us from too far away. Not to the jungle, not to the battlefield, not to the conference table where men in suits argued over maps, not to the helicopter landing pad, or the front page photograph that became famous around the world. Tonight we're going into the city. We're going into Saigon during the Vietnam War, but not the Saigon of headlines, speeches, and military briefings. We're going into the Saigon of morning vendors and crowded balconies, of radios humming in apartments, of school uniforms drying on lines above narrow alleys, of mothers bargaining over rice, of fathers reading newspapers with one eye on the street, of children learning to tell the difference between thunder, engines, fireworks, and something worse. And here is the thing that I want you to keep in mind as we begin. For the people who lived there, Saigon was not only a symbol, it was not only a capital city, not only a prize, not only a place that foreign correspondents wrote about from hotel rooms and cafe tables. It was home. That word matters. Home is where people worry about the price of fish. Home is where someone still has to sweep the floor even when the government is unstable. Home is where laundry still needs to dry, where babies still wake too early, where someone burns the rice at the bottom of the pot, where a neighbour knocks on the wall because the radio is too loud, where a young man checks his hair in a mirror before going out, because even in wartime, young people still care how they look. History has a habit of making war feel like a single enormous event, a machine moving across years, with armies, dates, offensives, casualties, and presidents. But inside that machine were millions of ordinary days, and tonight we're going to sit with one of those ordinary days, not because it was simple, and not because it was safe, but because it was human. Before we step into that city, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you in a quiet bedroom with the lights low? Are you on a couch after a long day? Are you somewhere where the window's open and you can hear cars passing outside? I ask because every city at night has its own sound, and Saigon had one too. It had bicycle bells, vendors calling out in Vietnamese, French words still clinging to old buildings, American voices spilling from bars and offices, radios carrying news that nobody could quite ignore, scooters coughing awake in the heat, and somewhere beyond the usual noise, the distant reminder that the war was not an idea. It was nearby. It could enter the city by road, by rumour, by explosion, by telegram, by the absence of someone who should have come home. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history not only as kings and battles but as rooms, meals, streets, habits, fears, and small acts of survival, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something in the story makes you pause for a second. Do it when you feel yourself settling into the past, not as a museum display, but as a place where people once stood in line, missed the bus, misplaced keys, lied to children so they would not worry, and tried to make the next day a little more manageable than the one before it. And if you want to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, or what time it is where you are, I genuinely love reading those. It is a strange and lovely thing to talk about the past while people in different parts of the world are listening in the present, some at midnight, some in the afternoon, some while the whole house is asleep. Now, dim the lights a little if you can. Let the room settle. We're going back to Saigon, somewhere in the late 1960s, though much of what we're about to see would have been familiar in the years before and after as well. The city was the capital of South Vietnam, officially the Republic of Vietnam, and it was one of the most crowded, tense, restless, complicated cities in Asia at the time. It had once been called by some the Pearl of the Far East, a phrase left over from the French colonial period, and if you walk through parts of the city in daylight, you could still see why someone had said it. Wide boulevards shaded by tamarind trees, Villas with shutters and tiled roofs, the red brick Notre Dame Cathedral rising above the square, the central post office with its arched interior and old colonial confidence, cafes where people still sat under fans and talked politics, as if talking might somehow keep the world in order. But that old elegance existed beside something much harder. Refugees had poured into the city from the countryside, driven by bombing, fighting, insecurity, and the collapse of village life in contested areas. Families who had once lived by fields and canals now found themselves crowded into alleys, makeshift settlements, spare rooms, market edges, and any patch of urban space that could be claimed. Saigon grew quickly, unevenly, and under pressure. It was not a city at peace that happened to have soldiers in it. It was a city trying to function while war leaned its weight against every wall. That is the Saigon we are entering. Not ruined, not silent, not frozen in fear, but alive in that exhausting way cities can be alive when too much is happening at once. There were government clerks in pressed shirts trying to get to offices. There were women carrying baskets on shoulder poles. There were students in white ao dai moving through traffic like bright threads through a loom. There were Buddhist monks, Catholic schoolchildren, Chinese merchants in Cholon, cyclo drivers, street boys, American military police, South Vietnamese soldiers, journalists, bar girls, black market dealers, grandmothers, mechanics, tailors, cooks, and children who had learned very young that adults changed their voices when certain subjects came up. To understand everyday life in wartime Saigon, we have to resist the urge to make it all one thing. It was not only fear, it was not only corruption, it was not only glamour, it was not only suffering, it was all of it pressed together so tightly that one could turn a corner and move from a flower stall to a sandbagged checkpoint, from a schoolyard to a military convoy, from a cinema poster to a funeral procession, from the smell of grilled pork to the smell of exhaust and dust. This is what war does to a city when the city is not completely destroyed, but cannot be normal either. It does not stop life. It interrupts it constantly. It makes ordinary actions carry extra calculation. Can we afford rice today? Is that road safe after dark? Has the curfew changed? Did the cousin from the province arrive? Who was taken for questioning? Which rumour should we believe? Is the market price higher because of inflation? Or because someone knows something we do not? Should the children go to school tomorrow if there was fighting near the edge of the city last night? These questions did not always arrive dramatically. They came folded into daily routines. A woman buying fish might hear news before the newspapers printed it. A taxi driver might know which district had soldiers out that morning. A shopkeeper might keep one set of prices for regular customers and another for men who arrived with foreign money. A family might keep documents wrapped carefully in a drawer, not because they planned to leave, but because in a city like Saigon, papers mattered. Identity papers, work papers, military papers, ration papers, school papers, letters from relatives, addresses written down in case telephones failed or someone disappeared into the movement of the war. We often imagine history as something that happens in public, but much of wartime history happens in drawers, kitchens, wallets, and whispered conversations after children are told to go to sleep. Imagine now a family living in Saigon during these years. Not an important family, not a general's family, not a minister's family, not a family wealthy enough to remain untouched by inconvenience, if such a family could truly exist in a city under strain. Just a family. Perhaps they live in a narrow house on a busy street, one of those urban homes built upward because there is more room in height than in width. The front room may open toward the street, and depending on the family's work, it might double as a shop during the day. There may be a metal gate pulled across at night. There may be a small family altar inside with incense, photographs, offerings, and the careful attention given to ancestors in many Vietnamese homes. There may be a radio on a shelf, a fan that works when the electricity does, a calendar from a business, a table polished by years of use, a thermos, enamel bowls, mosquito coils, school books, and a few objects that tell you the war has reached the household without needing to announce itself. A helmet belonging to an older son, a letter from a cousin in uniform, a bag kept ready longer than anyone admits, a photograph that nobody moves. Outside, Saigon is restless even before sunrise, but inside the house there is that short, fragile time when the day has not yet fully made its demands. Someone is awake before everyone else. In many homes it is the mother. That is not a sentimental guess. It is practical. Someone has to start the charcoal stove or check what is left from yesterday. Someone has to prepare rice, tea or coffee, wake children, organise clothing, deal with water, deal with money, deal with the small chain of tasks that makes a household appear to function. The war may be the largest fact in the city, but breakfast still has to be made. And that is one of the hardest things for modern viewers to truly absorb. Ordinary life during war is not ordinary because the danger is small. It is ordinary because people keep doing necessary things under conditions that should make them impossible. A mother still scolds a child for losing a sandal. A father still asks where his clean shirt is. A teenage girl still worries about whether her hair looks right before school. A grandmother still complains that the soup has too little salt. Someone still laughs at the wrong moment and then stops because the laugh felt almost disrespectful to everything going on outside. This mixture of normal and not normal was not a contradiction. It was the basic texture of the city. Saigon during the war was full of people learning how to continue, and continuing was not the same as being calm. It was a skill, a habit, sometimes a mask, sometimes an act of stubbornness. On some mornings, the city could look almost carefree to someone who did not know where to look. Cafes opened, newspapers were sold, street food steamed in metal pots, children moved through traffic, tailors measured cloth, music drifted from record shops, movie posters promised romance, comedy, action, and escape. American servicemen came and went in jeeps and buses, some looking young enough to still belong at their parents' kitchen tables. South Vietnamese soldiers moved through the same streets with a different familiarity, carrying the war not as a foreign assignment but as something tied to their own families, provinces, languages, and uncertain futures. The war economy created strange scenes. Imported goods appeared in markets where they officially should not have been. Cigarettes, canned food, radios, nylon stockings, medicine and military surplus could pass through hands in ways everyone understood and no one fully admitted. Money moved quickly, prices rose, some people made fortunes, many more simply tried not to fall behind. The city had elegance, but it also had hunger. It had nightlife, but also curfew. It had bright signs, but also blackouts. It had the sound of dance music in some rooms and prayers for missing sons in others. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not in a grand dramatic way, but plainly. A city can contain a great deal at once. Saigon did. There were people who went to work in offices where files were stamped and forms were processed while artillery could sometimes be heard in the distance. There were school lessons interrupted by rumours. There were weddings held during years when nobody knew what the country would look like by the time the marriage was old. There were babies born in hospitals that were too crowded, in homes where grandmothers helped, in clinics where the war was visible in the faces of the waiting. There were people who argued politics fiercely, and people who refused to discuss politics at all, because speaking carelessly could bring trouble from more than one direction. There were families with relatives on different sides, or suspected of being on different sides, and families who learned that survival sometimes required silence more than courage. There were civil servants who believed in the government, civil servants who did not, and civil servants who simply needed a salary. There were young men trying to avoid the draft, young men proud to serve, young men already wounded, young men who had learned to stand in a doorway and scan the street without appearing to do so. There were young women who learned to move through the city with alertness that was not quite fear but not freedom either. There were children who turned the debris of war into games until adults took the objects away. None of this fits neatly into the simple version of history where Saigon is only a backdrop to decisions made elsewhere. The city was not a backdrop. It was a living place, and the people inside it did not experience the Vietnam War as one continuous documentary montage. They experienced it as days, hot days, wet days, days with the electricity and days without it, days when rice cost more than it had last week, days when a cousin arrived with bad news, days when nothing happened and that nothing felt like a gift. There is a photograph many people carry in their minds when they think of Saigon during the war. Helicopters, rooftops, crowds, the final collapse in 1975. That image matters, but it is not where our story begins, because no city is only its ending. Before the final days, there were years of living. Years of people making coffee, catching cyclos, repairing shoes, attending mass, visiting pagodas, buying school notebooks, listening to government announcements, reading censored newspapers, laughing at jokes that could not be printed, and learning how to lower their voices when a stranger entered the room. To tell the story of everyday Saigon, we have to enter before the famous ending, while the city still believed in mourning because it had no choice. And there is something very important in that. Mourning is one of the most stubborn things human beings have. Even in war, especially in war, mourning arrives with its list. Open the shutters, heat the water, count the money, wake the children, sweep the front step, check the sky, listen to the street, decide whether today feels safe enough to proceed as planned. That last part is the one people rarely say out loud, but it was there. Safety was not an abstract condition. It was judged in details. Were there more soldiers than usual at the corner? Were the buses running? Did the neighbour send her son to school? Did the market open normally? Did the radio sound urgent? Did someone's face at the doorway suggest news? Ordinary people become experts in small signals when history places them under pressure. Saigon's families learned those signals. They learned the difference between a rumour that would pass by noon and a rumour that would empty a street. They learned which routes avoided checkpoints, which officials could be bribed, which neighbourhoods felt tense, which sounds required action, and which sounds could be ignored because if you reacted to every sound, you would never live at all. This is not the kind of knowledge people write proudly in memoirs. It is survival knowledge, practical, tiring, mostly invisible, and it shaped the day from the first cup of coffee onward. Let us begin then, not with a battle, but with a street waking up. The sky over Saigon is still pale. The heat has not yet settled fully into the walls. Somewhere a rooster calls, though the city is far too crowded to feel rural. A vendor lifts the cover from a pot and steam rises into the morning air. A cyclo driver adjusts his seat and waits for the first passenger. A woman opens a metal gate with a sound that carries farther than she wants it to. A child in a white shirt is being told to hurry. A radio crackles with news, music, or both, because even a radio can seem unsure what kind of day it is supposed to announce. The smell is coffee, charcoal, damp pavement, fish sauce, exhaust, bread, and dust. Saigon is awake, and before we understand its nights, its curfews, its fears, its markets, its cafes, its homes, and its private griefs, we need to walk through that first hour of daylight, when the city begins again and everyone steps outside carrying more history than they can possibly show. The first hour of morning in Saigon did not arrive all at once. It gathered itself in layers. Before the city became loud, before the traffic thickened, before soldiers and office clerks and schoolchildren and vendors all pressed into the same streets, there was a thinner kind of sound, the sound of preparation. A metal gate being lifted, a broom scratching dust away from a doorstep, a pot lid set down on a wooden stall, a match struck for a charcoal stove, a bicycle chain turning slowly as someone pushed off into the street before the sun had fully climbed. If you had been standing in Saigon in the late 1960s, in that narrow space between darkness and the working day, you would not have heard silence. Cities rarely give you silence. but you might have heard something close to a beginning, a careful stirring before the full weight of the day came down. And in wartime Saigon, that beginning mattered. Morning was not only the time when people woke up, it was when they tested the city. They listened to it. They looked at it. They tried to decide what kind of day history was going to allow them to have. The streets were active early because the heat made idleness expensive. Saigon sat in a climate that did not wait politely until noon to become uncomfortable. The air could feel heavy even in the morning, especially in the wet season, when moisture gathered on skin and walls and paper and clothing, making everything feel slightly unfinished. People who worked outside knew to begin before the strongest sun. Vendors wanted to reach good corners before others took them. Market women wanted the freshest fish and vegetables before prices rose or selection thinned. Cyclo drivers wanted passengers before offices opened. Students had to be ready in time for school. Families had to buy breakfast, fetch what was needed, and step into the day while it was still possible to move with some speed. There is a kind of intelligence in an early city, a practical understanding that the body can only argue with heat for so long. Saigon's morning was shaped by that knowledge. It moved quickly because the city itself would soon become difficult. One of the first things you would notice was food. Not meals in the formal sense, not a family sitting down around a table with everyone in place. Street food, breakfast food, working food, food made for people already moving. A woman might stand behind a pot of pho, steam rising around her face while she arranged bowls with noodles, herbs, slices of meat, and broth that had been prepared long before most customers arrived. Another vendor might sell XY, sticky rice wrapped in leaves or paper, sometimes with mung bean, sometimes with shredded chicken, sometimes sweet, sometimes plain enough to be eaten quickly by someone counting coins. There were banh mi stalls too, one of the clearest everyday reminders that Saigon's history did not begin with the war. The small French-style baguette, adapted into Vietnamese life, crisp on the outside, soft inside, filled according to money and availability, was not just a sandwich. It was colonial history turned into breakfast. Bread brought by the French, reshaped by Vietnamese hands, sold in a city where French names still clung to buildings, even as the war around them belonged to a different age. The bread carts mattered because they were practical. A person could buy, carry and eat without stopping for long. Office workers, students, soldiers, drivers, messengers, and labourers all needed food that could move with them. The city's breakfast was not leisurely for most people. It was a transaction between hunger, time, and money. A child might be handed a piece of bread before being sent towards school. A young man might eat while standing beside his bicycle. A woman might buy breakfast for more than one person, balancing food in one hand and a market basket in the other. Some families ate at home, of course. Rice left from the night before could be reheated. Tea or coffee could be made. A bowl of soup might be shared before the day broke apart. But the street fed Saigon in a way that made the city feel alive from the ground up. The food was not hidden behind doors. It steamed, crackled, and called out from the pavement. And then there was coffee. Vietnamese coffee in Saigon was not just a drink, and it was not simply an inheritance from French rule, though the French had brought coffee cultivation and cafe habits into colonial Indochina. By the war years, coffee had become part of the city's rhythm in its own local form. Thick, dark, often sweetened with condensed milk, served hot or iced, depending on weather, taste and access to ice. It belonged to conversations, newspapers, waiting, business, and the small pauses that people carved out for themselves. In the morning, coffee shops and sidewalk stalls became listening posts. Men read papers there. Students lingered there when they could. Drivers waited there for fares. People traded rumours there, and rumours in Saigon were not entertainment. They were one of the city's information systems. A rumour might tell you that a road was closed, that arrests had happened in the night, that prices would rise, that a minister had fallen, that fighting had moved closer, that a cousin's district was unsafe, that Americans were paying high for a certain imported good, that police were checking papers more aggressively near a certain street. Some rumours were false, some were partly true, some were true enough to change your route home. In wartime, the morning cafe was not only a place to wake up, it was a place to find out how carefully one needed to live that day. Newspapers were part of that same morning system. Saigon had a lively press, though it operated under pressure, censorship, political influence, and the risks that came with writing in a divided and unstable country. Newspapers could be sold early, folded and passed from hand to hand, scanned quickly by men who had learned to read between official lines. People did not need every article to tell them what was happening. Sometimes the placement of a story mattered. Sometimes what was not printed mattered more. A headline could travel through the city faster than the paper itself. A person might buy a paper for the news, for employment notices, for political argument, or simply because the act of reading one in public made the morning feel civilized. That is one of the strange things about cities under strain. People preserve ordinary gestures with stubborn care. They sit with coffee, they unfold the paper, they complain about the government, they complain about prices, they complain about the young. They do these things not because the world is stable, but because the gesture itself gives shape to the day. The traffic was different from the Saigon traffic people imagine today, but it was already dense, mixed, and restless. Bicycles were everywhere. So were cyclos, the three-wheeled bicycle taxis with the passenger seat in front and the driver pedalling behind. To ride in one was to be carried through the city at street level, seeing knees, wheels, baskets, sandals, uniforms, dogs, puddles, and the lower half of storefronts. A cyclo driver knew the city by weight and angle. He knew which roads were bad, which corners gave shade, which passengers might pay, which areas became difficult when police or soldiers were out in numbers. He did not simply pedal. He watched. He negotiated. He waited. He learned how to make a living from movement in a city where movement could be delayed by traffic, checkpoints, convoys, rain, suspicion, or sudden fear. Motorbikes and scooters were becoming more visible too. French-made Vélo Solex mopeds, small motorcycles, Lambrettas, Vespas, and the increasingly common Japanese Hondas gave Saigon a sharper mechanical sound. The putter and cough of engines joined the ring of bicycle bells and the calls of vendors. For those who could afford them, motorbikes changed the scale of the city. A student could go farther. A clerk could reach an office faster. A young man could look modern in a way that mattered. A family might treat a motorbike as a shared asset, something too valuable to leave unattended, something that represented status, mobility, and risk all at once. In wartime, even machines had politics around them. Access to foreign goods, spare parts, fuel and repairs could depend on money, connections, the black market, American presence, and the uneven flow of imported materials. A simple morning ride across the city could carry inside it a whole economy of war. American military vehicles changed the street's feeling. Jeeps, trucks, buses, and official cars moved through Saigon alongside local traffic, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with the confidence of men backed by institutions much larger than the street they were crossing. American personnel in Saigon were not all combat troops, and many worked in offices, logistics, advisory roles, communications, intelligence, medical services, journalism, and administration. But to ordinary residents, their presence was visible in ways that reached far beyond military bases. They brought dollars, demand, goods, noise, habits, and a certain distortion of prices. A street that had once served mainly Vietnamese customers might now have signs in English. Laundry shops, bars, restaurants, tailoring businesses, souvenir sellers, and taxi services adjusted to foreign money. This did not make Saigon simply an American city. That would be a lazy mistake. Saigon remained Vietnamese, layered with colonial memory, Chinese commercial life in Cholon, Catholic institutions, Buddhist practices, southern habits, refugee pressures, and rural ties. But the American presence altered the morning economy. A vendor who could sell to Americans might earn more. A child who knew a few English phrases might use them. A shopkeeper might keep certain goods hidden for certain customers. Dollars did not replace Vietnamese life, but they bent parts of it out of shape. On the sidewalks, women with shoulder poles moved through the morning with a balance that could look effortless to someone who did not understand the labour. The carrying pole, with baskets hanging from either end, was one of the most ordinary and efficient tools in the city. A vendor could carry fruit, vegetables, cooked food, baskets of noodles, or household goods, shifting weight with practiced adjustments of the shoulder and hip. These women were often the small merchants of Saigon's daily life, and the work was harder than it looked. They walked long distances, they competed for customers, they dealt with police, fees, harassment, weather, spoilage, and the simple fact that unsold food at the end of the day could mean a loss the household could not easily absorb. In wartime, inflation pressed hard on people who lived by small margins. The price of rice, charcoal, fish sauce, cooking oil, fabric, soap, medicine, and school supplies mattered intensely. A vendor had to know not only what something cost that morning, but what people could still afford by afternoon. You might see a woman selling fruit, perhaps bananas, papaya, pineapple, rambutan in season, or mangosteen if supply and money allowed. You might see another selling bowls of noodles, another selling cigarettes one by one, another selling tea, another selling lottery tickets, another selling small household items that had passed through more than one market before reaching her baskets. There were children selling too. War expands the labour of children. It does not always do so in a dramatic way. Sometimes it simply makes a child stand on a corner earlier than he should, carrying newspapers, polishing shoes, selling gum, watching younger siblings, or running errands in traffic that would frighten a parent in another kind of life. Saigon had many such children. Some had families nearby. Some were refugees from the countryside. Some had lost parents. Some were part of households stretched so thin that everyone had to earn something. In the morning they became part of the city's movement, small bodies weaving between adults, learning quickly which faces were generous, which were dangerous, which uniforms to avoid, and how to disappear when necessary. School children gave the morning a very different look. The white ao dai worn by many schoolgirls became one of the city's most remembered images, and for good reason. Against the dust, traffic, uniforms, advertisements, and military vehicles, those long white garments could make the street appear almost impossibly graceful. But that grace should not fool us into making the scene too soft. Students in wartime Saigon lived with pressure that went far beyond examinations. Schools could be disrupted by strikes, political unrest, bombings, military operations, family displacement, and the simple exhaustion of living in a country at war. Older boys faced the shadow of military service. University students could be politically active, watched, arrested, or drawn into arguments that had consequences beyond the classroom. Younger children might not understand policy or ideology, but they understood adult tension. They knew when parents spoke quietly. They knew which questions made a room uncomfortable. They knew that a school route could change because of events no child had caused. Still, they went. This is the fact that stays with me. They went to school. They carried books. They copied lessons. They memorized, recited, whispered, teased, and worried about marks. A city at war does not cancel childhood all at once. It damages it unevenly. A child might spend the morning doing arithmetic and the afternoon watching adults react to news of an attack. A girl might worry about ink on her sleeve while her family worried about a cousin in the army. A boy might kick a ball in an alley that also held sandbags. This is not contradiction. This is how daily life survives under pressure. Children keep being children in places where adults have fewer and fewer ways to protect them from history. Street sounds built as the morning advanced. A vendor's call might rise and fall along an alley. Someone hammered metal in a repair shop. A radio played music from a doorway. Another radio carried an official announcement. A dog barked. A bus groaned forward. A bicycle bell rang again and again, not angrily, just constantly, because the street was shared by too many kinds of movement. In some neighbourhoods, church bells could be heard. In others, temple sounds and incense marked the morning. Cholon, Saigon's large Chinese district, had its own commercial density, its own rhythms, its own shops, warehouses, temples, clan associations and food streets. Goods moved through Cholon in ways that helped feed and supply the wider city, legally and otherwise. The war made commerce more complicated, but it did not stop it. In fact, war often makes commerce both more necessary and more shadowed. People need more, trust less, pay higher, hide better, and learn which questions should not be asked. Benthan Market was one of the city's great centres of daily life. Not just a place to buy things, but a place where Saigon's pressures became visible in prices, shortages, bargaining, gossip, and the endless movement of goods. Market women were skilled readers of people. They knew when a customer was desperate. They knew who had foreign money. They knew what could be substituted when supply failed. They knew when a shipment had come in, when a road had been cut, when officials were inspecting, when someone was hoarding, when the price quoted in the morning would be impossible by evening. The market was not separate from war. It was one of the places where war became edible, countable, and personal. A military decision far away could become a higher price for rice. A supply disruption could become a smaller portion in a child's bowl. Inflation, corruption, refugee movement, American spending, damaged agriculture, insecure roads, and speculation all found their way into the basket a woman carried home. Think about that basket for a moment. It is easy to talk about war in terms of strategy, but a household experiences strategy through what can be bought and cooked. If rice costs more, the family adjusts. If fish is too expensive, the family adjusts. If charcoal is scarce, the family adjusts. If a cousin arrives from the countryside with 2 children and no money, the family adjusts. Adjustment sounds small until you imagine doing it every day with no clear end. A mother in Saigon might stand in the market calculating not only the price of food, but the emotional weather of her own household. How much can be stretched? Who needs to eat more? Can leftovers be used? Is there enough for a guest? Can something be saved in case tomorrow is worse? Will the children notice? What can be said cheerfully so no one becomes afraid? These calculations rarely appear in official histories, but they are the daily arithmetic of wartime survival. The city's mourning also belonged to repair. This is something modern viewers sometimes miss. In a place where money is uncertain and goods are unevenly available, repair becomes a way of life. Shoes repaired, bicycles repaired, radios repaired, fans repaired, clothing patched, metal gates fixed, watches opened, tyres inflated. A man with a small repair stall might know more about the practical condition of the neighbourhood than any official. He saw who could pay, who could not, who was preparing to leave, who had returned, who had sold something valuable, who had received money from abroad, who had a son in uniform, who had suddenly become quiet. Repair work made the street more than a route. It made it a network of observation. In wartime, privacy thinned. People still had secrets, many of them, but the city watched itself because watching was part of safety. There were also people who watched professionally. Police, military police, intelligence men, government officials and informants all had their place in Saigon's daily life. Not every street corner was tense, not every uniform meant immediate danger. But people understood that speech could travel. Political life in South Vietnam was complex, with anti-communism, nationalism, Catholic networks, Buddhist activism, student movements, military governments, civilian politicians, regional loyalties, and family histories all intersecting in ways that could not be reduced to one simple loyalty. Ordinary people learned caution. A morning conversation at a coffee stall might shift when a stranger approached. A joke might stop halfway. A newspaper might be folded. A name might not be spoken. This is one of the quiet ways war enters everyday life. It changes not only what people say, but the distance between a thought and a sentence. At the same time, the street was full of humour. That needs to be said because fear alone does not describe human beings well. Saigon was known for wit, quick talk, sharp bargaining, irony, and the ability to laugh at absurdity even when absurdity was dangerous. People made jokes about officials, about prices, about Americans, about shortages, about bureaucracy, about themselves. Humour did not mean people were not suffering. It meant they were alive and socially awake. A vendor could tease a customer into buying more. A cyclo driver could complain theatrically about traffic, while already knowing how to slip through it. A student could imitate a teacher. A shopkeeper could make a comment that everyone understood and no one repeated too loudly. In wartime, humour can be a pressure valve, but it can also be a form of intelligence. It lets people name reality without always naming it directly. The smell of the morning changed from street to street. Near food stalls, it was broth, grilled meat, fresh herbs, fish sauce, coffee, bread, smoke, and frying oil. Near traffic, it was exhaust, dust, rubber, hot metal, and damp pavement. Near markets, it was fish, fruit, wet baskets, cut vegetables, flowers, poultry, and the dense human smell of crowded commerce. After rain, the city smelled different, washed for a moment but not clean in any simple way. Water gathered in uneven streets. Mud appeared where pavement failed. Drainage could be poor. A white school uniform could be ruined by a passing vehicle. A vendor's goods could be spoiled by one badly timed downpour. The rainy season did not stop the city. It added another negotiation. Umbrellas, plastic sheets, rolled trousers, raised baskets, quick shelter under awnings. People in Saigon knew how to continue in rain because not continuing was rarely an option. Some mornings carried the memory of the night before. If there had been shelling on the outskirts, an explosion in the city, arrests, a firefight, or rumours of infiltration, the streets might open differently. People would still come out, but they would look longer before stepping fully into the road. Shops might open late. Mothers might hold children closer. Men might gather around newspapers with more urgency. Officials might appear at corners. Soldiers might check papers. A street that had been noisy the day before might begin with a strange restraint, as if everyone had agreed to speak more softly until the city proved it was safe. This was especially true after major shocks, and Saigon had more than one. The Tet Offensive in 1968 brought fighting into the city in a way that shattered any remaining belief that the capital was safely removed from the war. For people who lived through that period, the idea of the city as a protected rear area became harder to trust. Yet after the fighting, morning still returned. People cleaned debris. Markets reopened. Families repaired doors. Schools resumed when they could. The city absorbed the shock because it had to, but absorption is not the same as forgetting. Foreign journalists often saw Saigon in fragments: hotel lobbies, press briefings, military transport, rooftop bars, official interviews, street scenes observed between assignments. Some understood the city deeply. Others passed through and mistook visibility for knowledge. The ordinary resident saw a different Saigon. Not the city as a symbol of policy, but the city as a set of obligations. Pay the rent, find rice, avoid trouble, keep the children moving, help relatives, protect documents, maintain appearances, attend school, earn money, listen carefully, do not panic too early, do not relax too completely. This is a difficult emotional discipline, and many people practiced it without calling it discipline at all. By mid-morning, the early freshness was usually gone. The city grew louder, warmer, more crowded. The pale light hardened. Shadows shortened. The vendors who had sold breakfast shifted to other goods or moved on. Coffee cups emptied. Newspapers were folded under arms or left on tables for the next reader. Students disappeared through school gates. Office workers reached desks. Cyclos waited in clusters. Buses loaded and unloaded. Military vehicles pushed through civilian traffic with the impatience of larger machines. Somewhere a woman who had been awake since before dawn returned from the market and began the next stage of her work. Somewhere a shopkeeper counted the morning's money and worried it was not enough. Somewhere a young soldier ate quickly before reporting somewhere else. Somewhere a child repeated a lesson while the sound of engines moved past the classroom wall. The morning did not solve anything. It simply moved everyone forward. That may be the most important thing to understand about Saigon streets during the war. They were not only places where danger appeared. They were places where life kept making demands. The city woke because it needed to. It sold breakfast because people were hungry. It opened markets because households could not wait for peace to eat. It sent children to school because the future still had to be prepared for, even when nobody knew what shape that future would take. It repaired bicycles because people had to travel. It brewed coffee because adults needed to sit somewhere and talk. It rang bells, lifted gates, swept dust, counted change, boiled broth, and bargained over vegetables because that is what a city does when history has not yet decided what will become of it. And if we follow one of those market baskets back from the street, if we leave the noise behind for a moment and step through a doorway into a narrow house where the morning's purchases are set down on a table, the public life of Saigon begins to turn into something more private. The city outside is still moving, still shouting, still bargaining, still watching itself. But inside the home, another kind of wartime life is beginning, quieter, more controlled, and in some ways more revealing. There are fans that may or may not work, family altars tended with care, radios kept close, letters folded and refolded, children being corrected, meals being stretched, and rooms arranged to hold together a household that the war keeps trying to pull apart. There are certain homes that do not show their whole life from the street. From outside, a Saigon house during the war might look narrow, busy and practical. A metal gate at the front, a painted sign if the family sold something from the doorway, a tiled threshold worn smooth by sandals, maybe a bicycle leaning just inside, maybe a scooter if the household was doing well, maybe baskets stacked against the wall, ready for the next trip to the market. The front room faced the street because in a crowded city the boundary between private life and public life was never as firm as people pretended. A customer could stand where a child had eaten breakfast. A neighbour could call through the bars of the gate. A relative from the countryside could arrive with a bundle and become part of the household before anyone had time to discuss where everyone would sleep. Saigon homes in those years were not only places where families rested, they were places where families worked, stored goods, listened for news, received visitors, hid worry, argued quietly, prayed, counted money, and tried to keep the shape of normal life from collapsing under pressure. Step through the doorway, and the first thing you would probably feel is the heat. Not a dramatic heat that arrives once and then passes, but a steady presence in the walls, in the floor, in the furniture, in the air between people. The house might have high ceilings if it had been built in an older style, or open vents near the top of the walls to allow air to move, but much of the day still depended on fans. A ceiling fan turning slowly above the main room could become one of the most important objects in the house. It did not make the room cool exactly. It made the room possible. It moved the air enough that children could do homework, a grandmother could sit without feeling faint, a mother could chop vegetables without sweat falling into her eyes, a father could read the paper without constantly wiping his face. When the electricity failed, and electricity could fail for reasons both ordinary and connected to the war, everyone noticed immediately. Conversation changed, body shifted. Someone might say something about the power company, or about the government, or about sabotage, or about nothing at all because complaint did not make the fan start again. A hand fan appeared. A child was told to stop moving so much. A baby became harder to settle. The room seemed to shrink. That is one of the first things to understand about everyday life inside a Saigon home. Comfort depended on systems that did not always hold. Electricity, water, supply routes, school schedules, postal service, police order, prices, public safety, all of these things existed, but none of them could be trusted with the relaxed confidence that people in peaceful cities often take for granted. A household learned to keep alternatives: candles, oil lamps, stored water, extra rice if money allowed, charcoal, a small reserve of medicine, a list of relatives, a little cash hidden in more than one place, documents wrapped carefully against damp. The habit of preparation became so ordinary that it did not always feel like fear. It looked like housekeeping. It looked like a woman checking the rice jar before bed. It looked like a father making sure the family papers were in the same drawer. It looked like an older daughter knowing where the candles were kept. It looked like a grandmother reminding everyone not to use the last of something, because tomorrow was not guaranteed to be easier. Inside many Vietnamese homes, one of the most important places was not large. It might be a shelf, a cabinet, a polished wooden altar, or a carefully arranged space high enough to be respected and low enough to be tended. The family altar held photographs, incense, small offerings, flowers when they could be afforded, perhaps fruit, cups of tea, or simple food placed there with care. Ancestor veneration was not decoration. It was one of the ways a family understood itself across time. The dead were not treated as gone in the clean, distant way modern secular life often imagines death. They remained part of the household's moral structure. They were remembered, addressed, honoured, and included in ritual. In a city crowded with soldiers, refugees, foreign money, political fear, and uncertain news, the altar gave the home a vertical line through history. Parents, grandparents, and earlier generations were present in the room, not as ghosts in the frightening sense, but as members of the family whose names and faces helped hold the living in place. Think about what that meant during the war. A son might be away in the army, a cousin might be missing, a relative might have died in a province the family could no longer safely visit. A village grave might be unreachable because roads were dangerous, or because the area had changed hands too many times. The altar inside the Saigon home became more than a ritual object. It became a substitute for places the family could not go. A woman lighting incense in the morning might be doing something older than the war, older than the Republic of Vietnam, older than French rule, and yet the war changed the feeling of the act. She might bow before photographs while wondering whether another photograph would soon be added. She might place fruit before the ancestors, while calculating whether fruit was now too expensive to offer regularly. She might whisper a name in a room where the children could hear, but not fully understand. The ritual was quiet, but the emotions around it were not simple. Respect, duty, grief, fear, habit, and hope all passed through the same thin line of smoke rising from incense. The smell of incense mattered. It marked the home differently from the street. Outside there was exhaust, dust, frying oil, wet pavement, fish sauce, cigarette smoke, and hot metal. Inside, near the altar, there was a softer scent, though not necessarily peaceful. Incense can make a room feel still even when the people in it are not. A child might associate that smell with New Year, death anniversaries, prayers before an exam, a grandmother's hands, or the tense morning when a letter arrived. The altar did not stop the war at the door. Nothing did. But it reminded the family that the war was not the only story they belonged to. That mattered. A government could change. A city could be renamed. Armies could enter and leave. But the line of family, obligation, memory, and respect reached deeper than any one regime. People do not usually explain this to themselves while lighting incense. They simply do it. The act carries the meaning because it has been done so many times before. Near the altar, or sometimes in the same main room, there might be a radio. The radio was one of the central objects of wartime domestic life, and in Saigon, it could make the outside world enter the house with a speed that was both useful and exhausting. A family might listen to music, official announcements, news, speeches, weather reports, or foreign broadcasts if they had access and interest. The radio could be entertainment, but it was rarely only entertainment. It was a device for measuring danger. A father might turn the dial with a seriousness that told the children to lower their voices. A mother might keep working while listening from the kitchen area, not appearing to pay attention, but missing almost nothing. A teenager might prefer songs, but learn the names of places because the adults reacted whenever those places were mentioned. Provinces, roads, districts, offensives, negotiations, coups, bombings, arrests, ceasefire talk, casualty reports, government statements, American statements, communist statements, rumours that became news after enough people repeated them. The radio carried all of it into rooms where someone was also slicing vegetables or sewing a school button back onto a shirt. There is something very specific about listening to news in a house, where the news may involve someone you know. It is different from listening as a citizen only. A map becomes personal when your brother is stationed near one of the names being read. A report from the countryside becomes personal when your mother's village is in that direction. A change in policy becomes personal when your son is close to draft age. A mention of unrest becomes personal when the market you use is near the place being described. In Saigon, the war was both national and domestic. It could be discussed in newspapers and in cabinet meetings, but it also sat beside the rice pot, the school bag, the laundry basin, and the family altar. People learned to listen without always reacting. That was a household skill. If children saw too much fear on adult faces, they became frightened. If neighbours heard too much in your voice, they might repeat it. If you believed every report, you could become useless with anxiety. If you believed nothing, you could be caught unprepared. Listening well was not passive, it was work. The room itself had to serve many purposes. In a narrow urban house, space was rarely neutral. The front area might be a shop during the day and a family room at night. A table might hold merchandise in the morning, a meal at noon, homework in the afternoon, and folded clothes after dark. Mats could be rolled out for sleeping. Curtains might divide space where walls did not. A wooden cabinet could hold dishes, documents, medicine, photographs, savings, and objects that had survived earlier moves. If relatives had come from the countryside, which happened often as war pushed people toward the city, rooms became more crowded. A family that had already been living tightly might make room for an aunt, 2 cousins, or a widowed grandmother. Hospitality was not simply kindness, it was obligation. And during wartime, obligation could be heavy. Turning away, family was shameful or impossible, but taking them in meant more rice, less sleeping space, more noise, more tension, and more people whose safety had to be considered. Refugees changed the life of Saigon not only in camps and settlements, but inside private homes. A cousin from a contested district did not arrive as a statistic. He arrived with a tired face, a bag, and a story that was told in pieces. A woman from the countryside might not know how long she would stay. Children who had grown up near fields had to learn city streets. Grandparents missed graves, trees, animals, and neighbours left behind. Urban relatives might feel sympathy and strain at the same time. The city offered safety of a kind, schools of a kind, work of a kind, and danger of another kind. Inside the home, these changes appeared as extra sandals by the door, another bowl at the meal, someone sleeping near the front room, a new voice in the morning, a whispered discussion about money after the children were asleep. War often enters a household not as an explosion, but as one more person who needs a place to sleep. Water shaped the day more than many histories mention. Depending on the neighbourhood and the household, water might come through pipes irregularly, be bought, stored, boiled, carried or rationed carefully. A home needed water for rice, tea, washing, bathing, cleaning, and cooling small discomforts before they became larger ones. In the heat, the absence of reliable water was not a minor inconvenience. It changed tempers, it changed hygiene, it changed how much laundry could be done, how children were washed before school, how dishes were cleaned, and how illness was managed. A mother might know exactly how much water remained in a jar without measuring it. She might scold a child for wasting what seemed to him like one small cup. He would remember the scolding, but maybe not the fear beneath it. Adults in wartime often sound strict when what they really are is calculating risk faster than children can understand. The kitchen area, whether it was a separate room, a corner, or a space behind the main living area, was the centre of another kind of survival. Cooking in wartime Saigon could be simple or elaborate depending on class, income, access, and occasion. But for most ordinary households it involved stretching. Rice was the base around which much else was organised. Fish sauce, vegetables, herbs, small amounts of meat or fish when available, preserved foods, soups, pickles, leftovers and market purchases all had to be arranged into meals that satisfied not only hunger, but dignity. A meal should still feel like a meal. That mattered. People can survive on less than they prefer, but they do not stop caring about taste, order and pride. A mother might apologise for a thin soup even when no apology was needed. A grandmother might insist that rice be handled properly. A child might complain and be sharply corrected because complaints sounded too much like ingratitude in a house where adults knew exactly how hard food had become. The small rituals of food preparation helped hold the household steady. Washing rice, cutting herbs, tasting broth, setting bowls, calling children, saving the best piece for someone who needed strength, or for a guest, or for a father whose authority was recognised even when money was short. These gestures were not always fair by modern standards, and not every household was gentle. Patriarchy, hierarchy, age, gender, and duty all shaped domestic life. Older children, especially girls, carried responsibilities that could make childhood shorter. They watched younger siblings, helped cook, cleaned, fetched, sewed, and learned to anticipate adult needs. Boys might be given more freedom, but also lived under the shadow of military service and political suspicion as they grew older. A home could be loving and unequal at the same time. That is not a contradiction. It is simply one of the ways families often worked. The fan turned when power was available. The radio spoke when someone turned the dial. The altar received incense. The stove produced meals. These objects sound ordinary, but each one helped manage a different kind of uncertainty. The fan managed the body. The altar managed memory and duty. The radio managed information. The stove managed hunger. Add to them the locked drawer, the stored water jar, the mosquito net, the school books, the sewing kit, the identity papers, the medicine bottle, the extra rice, the photograph of a son in uniform, and you begin to see that the wartime home was not a passive refuge. It was an operating system. Every object had work to do. Every routine answered some pressure. Even sweeping the floor mattered. Dust came in from the street. Mud came in with rain. Children tracked in grit. Visitors noticed disorder. A clean floor said the household still had standards. In a city where so much felt beyond control, a swept floor was not trivial. There were times of day when the house became a waiting room. Late afternoon could feel that way if someone was expected home before curfew or before the streets became less predictable. A mother might keep one ear turned toward the gate. A younger child might be sent to look down the alley. A father might pretend not to worry. The radio might be on low. Dinner might be held a little longer than usual. Waiting during wartime has its own physical habits. People stand and sit too often. They listen for footsteps. They mishear engines. They ask the same question in different words. Where is he? Did he say he would be late? Which route did he take? Was there trouble near the bridge? Should someone go look? Or would that create two worries instead of one? The ordinary delay that in peacetime would earn annoyance could become the beginning of fear. When the person finally arrived, the household might react with irritation instead of relief. That is a very human thing. A son walks in late and his mother scolds him before she has time to embrace him. A husband returns and his wife asks why he did not send word. A daughter comes through the gate and is told sharply that she should know better than to worry everyone. Beneath the scolding is love, but love under pressure does not always sound soft. It often sounds like anger because anger is easier to release than fear. In Saigon, homes during the war, many families became fluent in this hidden language. Children heard adults argue about small things when the real subject was something larger. Money, safety, loyalty, reputation, the future, whether to stay, whether to leave, whether leaving was even possible, whether a relative could be trusted, whether a son should report, hide, study, marry, work, or somehow avoid being swallowed by events. The telephone, if the household had one, carried its own tension. Not every family did. A telephone line was useful but also unreliable, public in its own way, and sometimes suspect depending on what was said and who might be listening. Many messages still travelled by hand through neighbours, letters, workplace contacts, schoolmates, drivers, or relatives moving across the city. A knock at the door could mean a customer, a neighbour, a soldier, a messenger, a beggar, a relative, a policeman, or bad news. People learn to pause before opening. That pause is easy to overlook, but it tells us a great deal. In a fully safe home, the door is only a door. In Saigon, the door was a boundary that had to be managed. A family might live with the front room open to business all day and still feel the need to close itself quickly when the wrong person approached. Even the arrangement of sleeping carried the war inside the body. In crowded homes, people slept close. Mats, beds, hammocks, and folded bedding appeared where the day had held other activities. Children might sleep near siblings, cousins, grandparents. Adults might sleep lightly. Heat made rest difficult. Mosquitoes made it worse. Noise from the street did not vanish just because the family lay down. A curfew could reduce movement, but it did not make the city silent. Dogs barked. Vehicles passed. A distant sound could wake someone who then waited to see whether it would repeat. During periods of greater danger, families might choose sleeping positions with care, away from windows, near the back, closer together, with documents nearby, with sandals placed where they could be found quickly. These are the details people remember years later, not always the official dates, where they slept, what they kept by the door, the sound their mother made when she woke in the night, the way the fan stopped before the house became too hot to remain asleep. And still, inside these homes, life was not only strain. That has to be said carefully, because it is easy to turn wartime families into figures of endless suffering and forget their ordinary moods. People laughed inside these rooms. They celebrated holidays. They prepared for Tet when they could, cleaned, cooked, visited, honoured ancestors, gave children small gifts, and tried to begin the lunar year properly even when the war made beginnings feel uncertain. They listened to music. Young people cared about fashion. Children played games. Grandmothers told stories. Someone sang while washing dishes. Someone fell in love and tried to hide it badly. A family argued about a marriage proposal. A child was praised for doing well at school. A neighbour came over and stayed too long. There were jokes, irritations, gossip, boredom, tenderness, pride, embarrassment, and all the small emotions that continue because human beings are not built to feel only history. They feel the soup is too salty. They feel the shirt is missing a button. They feel the baby has finally slept. They feel someone has taken the good seat near the fan. That is why the family home is so important to this story. It shows us the war at the size people actually lived it. The Vietnam War was enormous, but inside a Saigon home it could become a radio turned low, a fan stopping in the heat, an altar with one more photograph, a bag of rice that had to last, a late son, a quiet father, a mother washing bowls after everyone else had moved away from the table. None of these things replaces the larger history. They reveal it. They show how international decisions, military campaigns, political crises, and economic pressure entered the most private spaces and became part of the air a family breathed. By evening, the house had changed again. The street outside remained active, but the household drew inward. The day's purchases had been used or stored. School books were gathered. The altar might receive incense once more. The radio might be turned on for news, then turned down when the children came too close. The fan, if it worked, moved warm air across tired faces. Someone counted money. Someone mended clothing. Someone prepared food for the next morning. The gate was checked. The documents remained where they were supposed to be. A child asked a question and was told, "Not now." Another child listened anyway. In the kitchen area, the smell of rice and fish sauce lingered. Near the altar, incense thinned into the room. The home had done what it was meant to do for one more day. It had held people together, not perfectly, not peacefully, not without anger or fear, but together. And just beyond the doorway, the city's markets were preparing to tell the same story in another language, through prices, shortages, bargaining, favours, substitutions, and the daily question that sat behind every basket carried home through Saigon's crowded streets. How much would tomorrow cost? How much would tomorrow cost? That was not a dramatic question in Saigon. It was not something spoken with a hand to the forehead or a stare out the window. It was practical. It could be asked silently while counting bills in the palm. It could be asked while looking at the bottom of the rice jar. It could be asked while a woman tied her market basket, checked the small coins wrapped in cloth, and stepped back into the street before the best vegetables were gone. In a city under pressure, the market was not simply where people bought food. It was where the war became visible in numbers. It was where policy became a price. It was where inflation entered the household one handful of rice at a time. It was where people learned before any official announcement whether the roads were safe, whether the countryside had been cut off, whether fuel was short, whether merchants were frightened, whether American goods had arrived, whether the pista had weakened again, whether someone was hoarding, whether tomorrow would be harder. Let us follow the basket back out into the city. The morning is now fully awake, and the market is no longer gently stirring. It is working. Benthan Market, with its clock tower and busy entrances, had already been part of Saigon's public life for decades by the war years. It was not the only market, of course. Saigon had neighbourhood markets, street markets, pushcart sellers, shophouses, Cholon's dense commercial streets, small stalls in alleys, and informal sellers who appeared wherever customers and police tolerance could be found. But a large market like Benthan helps us understand the whole system, because almost everything about the city passed through places like it. Food, news, suspicion, gossip, goods from the countryside, imported products, black market items, money changing, social rank, and the daily skill of bargaining all met there under one roof and around its edges. The first thing you would notice was the closeness. Markets are never only visual places, they press against the body. People move past with baskets, elbows, children, bicycles, bundles, sacks, and the impatience of those who know that time affects price. Fish sellers call out before the fish loses its morning shine. Vegetable sellers arrange herbs so they look fresher than they are. Rice dealers sit near sacks that represent not just food, but security. A family with rice in the house can think differently than a family without it. A jar of fish sauce, a bundle of greens, a few eggs, a little pork, a packet of tea, some charcoal soap if the money stretches that far, maybe a small luxury for a child if the day has been kind. Each object is ordinary. Together they form the daily budget of survival. Rice sat at the centre of that budget. In Vietnam, rice was not simply a food among others. It was the base of a meal, the measure of sufficiency, the thing that turned side dishes into dinner. A pot of rice could make a thin soup feel more complete. It could stretch fish, vegetables, pickled items, or a small amount of meat across more mouths. The question was not whether rice mattered. Everyone knew it mattered. The question was how much it cost, how clean it was, whether the family could buy enough, whether the quality had declined, whether the seller was holding back better sacks for richer customers or those with connections. In wartime South Vietnam, this question became more complicated because the country's rice economy had been damaged by the war itself. The Mekong Delta remained one of the great rice-growing regions of Asia, but fighting, insecurity, transport disruption, military operations and political instability all affected what could move from field to city. A country known for rice could still find its urban families worrying over rice prices. That is the sort of historical fact that sounds strange until you imagine the roads. Food does not simply exist in a city because it exists somewhere in the countryside. It has to travel. Farmers have to plant and harvest. Traders have to buy. Boats and trucks have to move. Officials, soldiers, tax collectors, police, insurgents, middlemen and thieves can all stand between the field and the bowl. During the war, rural insecurity and damaged transport made that chain uncertain. A sack of rice arriving in Saigon carried more than grain. It carried the condition of canals, roads, village security, fuel availability, bribes, storage, speculation and fear. By the time a mother in Saigon placed her hand into the rice sack to judge quality, she was touching the end of a long and fragile system. Prices did not rise in a way that felt mathematical to ordinary people. Economists and officials could produce indexes, percentages, tables and reports. A household experienced inflation as embarrassment and adjustment. Yesterday's money did not buy today's food. A woman who had planned carefully found that her carefulness had expired overnight. The rice was higher, the fish was higher, charcoal was higher, soap was higher, school notebooks were higher. Medicine was not only higher, it might not be available where it was supposed to be. The official price, the controlled price, the posted price, the actual price, and the price for someone the seller knew could be different things. That was one of the exhausting parts. Inflation is not only the rising cost of goods, it is the destruction of trust in planning. It makes the future smaller. You stop thinking in months and start thinking in days. You stop asking what would be wise and start asking what can still be bought before the money weakens again. Inside the market, this produced a very particular kind of bargaining. Bargaining was part of market life even without war, but wartime gave it sharper edges. A seller could not simply lower prices out of sympathy. She had costs too. She had paid more to obtain the goods, she might owe money, she might have lost stock to spoilage, police seizure, theft, or a bad transport day. She might be supporting a family as strained as the buyers. The buyer, on the other hand, could not simply accept every price. A few piastres mattered. A small overpayment could mean less fish sauce later, fewer vegetables, no treat for a child, or the need to borrow. So the two women performed a negotiation that had emotion inside it, but could not become too emotional. The seller insisted. The buyer accused her of being unreasonable. The seller pointed to costs. The buyer mentioned children. The seller gave a little, or pretended to. The buyer walked away, or pretended to. This was theatre, mathematics, and survival all at once. Fish sauce was one of the things that made a poor meal feel like it belonged to the table. Nuoc Mam carried salt, depth, smell, memory, and identity. A bowl of rice with a small amount of fish sauce could still be food in the fullest sense. A dipping bowl at the centre of a meal could make vegetables, fish, eggs, or leftovers feel connected. Its smell marked the household as surely as incense did, but in another register entirely. Fish sauce was practical, but it was also cultural. It came from coastal production, from fish and salt and thyme, from barrels and fermentation, from places like Phu Quoc and Phan Thiet, whose names carried associations of quality. By the time it reached a Saigon market, the war had already touched the routes by which such goods travelled. Bottles and jars had to be transported, salt had to be available, fuel had to be found, Merchants had to decide what to send, what to hold, what to charge. A housewife judging fish sauce was judging not only taste but honesty. Was it diluted? Was the smell right? Was the seller passing off a weaker product? In hard times, adulteration becomes one more form of anxiety. People learn to smell carefully. There is something humbling about the way a basic condiment can reveal a whole society under strain. Fish sauce, rice, charcoal and cooking oil do not appear in diplomatic histories with the same force as troop levels and peace talks. But for a family, they were daily necessities. You could dislike a government in theory, but you measured its failure in the market. You could support a cause in words, but still resent the official who could not keep prices stable. You could listen to speeches about sacrifice and still stand before a rice seller wondering how sacrifice was supposed to be cooked for dinner. This is where public legitimacy becomes private irritation. When people say a wartime government lost confidence, it can sound like an abstract political statement. Often it began as a market feeling, a sense that officials did not know or did not care what ordinary people were paying. Black markets flourished because official systems did not match reality. That sentence is plain, but it contains much of Saigon's wartime economy. Whenever goods are restricted, subsidized, rationed, imported through special channels, taxed unevenly or available to some groups more easily than others, a second economy grows beside the first. In wartime South Vietnam, that second economy became impossible to ignore. American money, military supplies, aid commodities, post-exchange goods, imported cigarettes, canned food, medicine, fuel, watches, radios, fabric, liquor, and countless small items could slip from official channels into informal ones. Not every black market transaction looked like a criminal drama. Sometimes it looked like a woman buying a bar of soap from someone who knew someone. Sometimes it looked like a soldier selling what he could get cheaply to someone who could resell it. Sometimes it looked like a shopkeeper with imported goods hidden until the right customer arrived. Sometimes it looked like currency changing hands in Cholon at a rate that said more about confidence than any government statement. The black market was not separate from the legal market in a clean way. It seeped into it. Goods did not always wear labels explaining how they had arrived. A can might have begun in an American supply chain. A carton of cigarettes might have passed through a military store, a pilfered shipment, an intermediary, a street dealer, and a small shop before reaching a civilian buyer. A bottle of medicine might be both illegal in its route and urgently needed in its use. That is why moral judgment becomes complicated. There were people who profited shamelessly from the war. There were people who stole, bribed, exploited, and grew rich while others struggled. But there were also ordinary families who bought from the black market because the official market failed them. A mother with a sick child does not always have the luxury of caring where the medicine came from. A father who needs fuel to keep a small business running may pay the price asked. A student who needs paper may buy what is available. The black market was corruption, yes, but it was also adaptation. Foreign currency added another layer. The official exchange rate and the street rate did not tell the same story. Dollars carried power because they were stable, desirable, and connected to the American presence. Military payment certificates, designed for use by American personnel, became part of a larger world of exchange and evasion. Piastres were the money of daily life, but confidence in them rose and fell under pressure. A person paid in piastres might watch prices climb faster than wages. A person with access to dollars, or to goods purchased through dollar-linked systems, could have advantages far beyond formal income. That difference changed relationships. It changed neighbourhoods. It changed who could marry well, who could rent, who could buy medicine, who could open a shop, who could leave, who could pretend not to be worried. Money in wartime is never only money. It is access to safety. In Saigon, the presence of Americans intensified this. American soldiers and civilians were customers, employers, sources of goods, sources of dollars, and symbols of a larger war that many Vietnamese had to navigate, whether they welcomed them, resented them, depended on them, or all three at once. A tailor might earn more making clothes for foreigners than for local customers. A bar or restaurant might adjust prices toward American spending. A vendor might learn English phrases because English could turn into money. A family with a daughter working in a place connected to foreigners might benefit financially and suffer socially. A young man with access to American supplies might be envied, suspected, and courted. The economy of Saigon was not simply inflated by war. It was reorganized around unequal access. Cholon, the Chinese commercial district, played a major role in this world of goods, credit, storage, wholesale trade, and currency. It had long been central to southern Vietnam's commercial life, and during the war its importance did not disappear. Warehouses, merchants, rice dealers, importers, and money changers helped move goods through a city that could not live on official channels alone. For some Vietnamese, Cholon represented commercial skill and practical necessity. For others, it became a place associated with speculation, hoarding, and hidden power. In times of inflation, merchants are often accused of causing what they are also surviving. Some did manipulate supply. Some profited from shortages. Others simply understood earlier than everyone else that tomorrow's price would be higher, so selling too cheaply today could ruin them. Markets under pressure produce suspicion because every price looks like someone's decision, even when it is also the result of forces far beyond the stall. Let us return to the woman with the basket because the whole machinery becomes clearest through her. She has a set amount of money. Perhaps her husband's pay has not kept up with prices. Perhaps a relative has arrived and stretched the household. Perhaps her son needs school fees. Perhaps someone is ill. Perhaps the family has a little hidden reserve. But touching it feels dangerous because once emergency money becomes food money, there is no emergency money left. She walks through the market comparing not only prices but faces. Which seller will be fair today? Which one has good rice? Which one is watering down sauce? Which one will give credit until the end of the week? Credit mattered. Trust mattered. A relationship with a seller could be as valuable as a coin. In a crisis, a familiar customer might receive a better measure, a warning, a small extension, or a discreet chance to buy something before it vanished. Survival often depends on being known by the right people in small ways. She buys rice first because rice sets the rest of the day. Then fish sauce if the jar at home is low, vegetables if they are not too wilted, a little fish if the price allows, perhaps dried shrimp, tofu, eggs, or a small piece of pork. Pork might be too expensive. Beef might be out of reach. Chicken may be for a better occasion. A few herbs make food feel fresh. A chili, a lime, something sour, something salted, something that tells the mouth the meal has not surrendered entirely to hardship. This is important. People under pressure still care about taste. The idea that the poor or anxious eat only for calories is false. Taste is one of the last forms of dignity a household can defend. A thin meal, seasoned properly, can feel less humiliating than a careless one. A mother who manages flavour with little money is practising a skill that deserves more respect than history usually gives it. Around her, other market lives unfold. A young soldier buys cigarettes. A schoolgirl sent on an errand counts coins twice. A grandmother complains that the herbs were better before. A man in a clean shirt asks about imported goods quietly. A vendor claims there is no more of something, and then produces it for a customer she trusts. A child watches a pile of oranges as if desire itself might make one fall unnoticed. A police officer passes and some sellers adjust their posture. A money changer lowers his voice. A woman hears that a road was cut last night. Another says that is old news. Someone else says the fighting is farther away. Someone laughs too loudly. Someone warns her not to laugh. The market is not chaos to the people who use it daily. It has rules, signals, reputations, and rhythms. Outsiders see noise. Regulars see information. The sound of the market carried the war differently from the radio. The radio spoke officially or dramatically. The market spoke through correction. No, not that price. No, not today. No, there is none left. No, that road is bad. No, pay now. No, I cannot give credit again. No, do not ask where it came from. These sentences are not the language of speeches, but they can tell you more about how people were living. A government may announce stability. A market can contradict it by noon. A military command may report progress. A rice seller can tell you whether the countryside is secure enough to feed the city. A foreign advisor may speak of development. A mother standing in front of cooking oil knows whether development reached her kitchen. There was also the question of status. Markets reveal class quickly. A wealthy woman, or her servant, could buy better rice, fresher meat, imported canned goods, French products, American items, medicine, powdered milk, soap, fabric, or sweets. A poorer woman bought carefully and visibly. Everyone could see hesitation. Everyone could see the moment when a buyer wanted something and chose not to ask the price. This exposure could be painful. Poverty in a market is public. You cannot hide the size of the measure forever. You cannot hide that you ask for bones instead of meat, broken rice instead of whole grains, a smaller portion, a cheaper fish, a promise to pay later. Yet markets also created community among those who understood. A seller might add a handful. A neighbour might share news of a cheaper stall. An older woman might teach a younger one how to stretch a dish. Wartime Saigon was full of sharpness, but it was not without kindness. Kindness simply had to survive in the same space as calculation. Imported goods had a strange power over imagination. A can of American food, a tin of milk, a packet of cigarettes, a bar of soap, a bottle of shampoo, a nylon item, a radio part, a watch, a flashlight, batteries, medicine, chocolate, chewing gum, even empty containers could carry meaning beyond use. They suggested access to another world, one supplied by ships, planes, bases, warehouses, and dollars. Children noticed these things. A child who tasted something from an American package might remember the sweetness longer than the politics. Adults noticed too, though with more complicated feelings. Imported goods could be useful, desirable, resented, expensive, embarrassing, or morally suspect depending on how they entered the house. To own them might signal cleverness, good connections, foreign contact, or simply necessity. Saigon's domestic spaces filled here and there with objects whose roots could not be discussed too plainly. The government understood the danger of this economy, but understanding and controlling are different things. Officials could announce measures against speculation, currency manipulation, smuggling, and black market trading. Police could raid, regulations could be written, exchange reforms could be attempted, rice marketing could be reorganized, price controls could be posted. But a city of millions under wartime pressure is difficult to command by paper. If an official price is too low, sellers hide goods. If a currency rate is unrealistic, money moves elsewhere. If imported goods are scarce, people pay privately. If salaries do not match food prices, workers find secondary income. If public systems fail, private systems expand. The market was not more powerful than the state in every sense, but it was more immediate. It answered hunger faster. And there was hunger in Saigon, though not always the dramatic famine hunger that history records with photographs. There was the quieter hunger of reduced portions, cheaper food, skipped luxuries, thinner soup, rice stretched with other ingredients, children told they had already eaten enough, adults pretending not to be hungry, elderly people refusing the better piece so a young person could have it. There was the hunger of refugees who arrived without stable work. There was the hunger of families whose wages collapsed against inflation. There was the hunger of people too proud to beg and too poor to buy. Saigon had restaurants, cafes, bars, and wealthy tables at the same time. That contrast was part of the city's strain. A war economy can create abundance in one doorway and shortage in the next. When the woman finally leaves the market, her basket is heavier, but perhaps not heavy enough to comfort her. She has spent more than she meant to, or she has bought less than she hoped. She may stop once more for charcoal, because food cannot become a meal without fuel. She may meet a neighbour and exchange 2 minutes of news that will become part of the household's understanding of the day. She may tuck money deeper into her clothing before passing a crowded corner. She may avoid a street where police are checking. She may hurry because the fish needs cleaning. The children will return, and the house does not run itself simply because the market was difficult. This is the part that feels almost unfair. After the bargaining, walking, counting, worrying and carrying, the work has only changed location. Now the food must be washed, cut, cooked, stretched, served, and made to seem sufficient. Back inside the home, the market enters the kitchen. Rice is poured into a pot. The quality is judged again. A little fish sauce is tasted. Vegetables are sorted, the best leaves used first. Bruised parts cut away. Nothing is wasted if it can be helped. Bones become broth. Stale bread can be repurposed. Leftover rice can become breakfast. A small fish can flavour a larger meal if handled carefully. A little pork fat can improve vegetables. The household's survival depends on this kind of attention. It is not glamorous. It does not appear in military archives as strategy. But in a real family, this is the strategy. Buy carefully. Cook intelligently. Stretch without making everyone feel deprived. Hide fear when possible. Admit shortages only when necessary. Keep enough aside for mourning. By afternoon, the market's news is spread. A father hears that prices rose again and blames the government, or merchants, or Americans, or communists, or corruption, or fate, depending on his politics and mood. A grandmother says things were different before, which may be true and may also be what grandmothers say everywhere. A child asks why a favourite food is not on the table. The mother says it was not good today, which may be kinder than saying it was too expensive. The radio gives another report. The fan turns. The altar watches silently from its place in the room. Outside, the city continues to trade, argue, and adjust. Somewhere in Cholon, money changes hands at a rate that will affect tomorrow's prices. Somewhere at a military facility, goods are counted, lost, stolen, or sold. Somewhere a farmer looks at a road and decides whether it is safe enough to send produce toward the city. Somewhere a government official writes about economic stability. Somewhere a mother looks into a pot and decides whether to add more water. That is why the market belongs at the centre of this story. It was not a colourful background scene. It was the place where Saigon's families met the war every day without necessarily naming it. They met it in rice sacks, in fish sauce jars, in imported cigarettes, in currency rates, in empty shelves, in sudden abundance that everyone knew had a questionable source, in prices that punished the honest and rewarded the connected, in the skill of vendors who could read a crowd better than any economist. The market showed that survival was not only bravery under fire, it was endurance under arithmetic. It was the ability to keep going when the cost of going kept changing. And when the meal was finally prepared, when bowls were set down and the family gathered again, the market did not vanish. It sat there in the portion size, in the quality of rice, in the thinness of soup, in the little bowl of fish sauce placed carefully where everyone could reach it. It was in the mother's silence if someone complained. It was in the father's face if he knew his pay had not stretched far enough. It was in the child's pleasure at a small sweet bought despite everything. It was in the guest being served first because manners did not disappear just because times were hard. Saigon's markets fed the city, but they also taught it how to measure uncertainty. Every purchase was a small wager that tomorrow could still be managed. Every basket carried home was a report from the front line of ordinary life. The next morning the basket would go out again. That was the rhythm. The city could not pause until the economy made sense. Families could not wait for inflation to settle, for roads to be secured, for officials to become honest, for the war to end, or for the future to announce itself clearly. Children still needed breakfast. Workers still needed food. Ancestors still received offerings when offerings could be made. Guests still arrived. Illness still came. School still required notebooks. Clothes still wore thin. So people returned to the stalls, to the sellers they trusted, and the sellers they did not, to the prices they resented and the goods they needed, to the bargaining that was half argument and half relationship. They returned because there was no other way to live in the city except to keep entering it, keep calculating, keep listening, keep carrying home whatever the day allowed. And once the morning market had done its work, Saigon pushed its people into the rest of the day. Children moved toward classrooms with lessons waiting for them. Clerks and secretaries entered offices where paperwork piled up despite the war. Soldiers reported for duty. Shopkeepers opened shutters. Tailors bent over cloth. Mechanics leaned into engines. Students argued politics in low voices or loud ones, depending on courage, youth, and who might be listening. The city's private calculations became public motion again, and the question of how to live under pressure moved from the basket and the kitchen into schools, workplaces, ministries, barracks, factories, and the long hours of waiting that filled so much of ordinary life. The city's private calculations became public motion again, and by the time the sun was high enough to turn the walls warm to the touch, Saigon had entered the long working part of the day. This was the time when the city looked most determined to prove that it could still function. School gates opened. Office doors swung inward. Typewriters began their sharp little clatter behind government walls and company desks. Tailors leaned over cloth. Mechanics crouched beside scooters. Secretaries sorted papers in rooms where ceiling fans pushed warm air from one corner to another. Teachers stood before blackboards and wrote lessons that had to continue, even if the country around the classroom could not agree on what kind of future those lessons were preparing children for. The morning market had answered the question of food. Now the city had to answer another question, one that was harder to name but just as important. How does a normal day continue when nobody can fully trust the world beyond the next few hours? School is a good place to begin because school carries an expectation that the future is still open. A child walking to class with books under one arm is a quiet argument against collapse. In wartime Saigon, that argument happened every morning. Boys in neat shirts, girls in white ao dai, younger children with satchels and polished hair, older students carrying notebooks, all of them moving through a city where adults measured danger in traffic patterns, rumours, checkpoints, and the tone of the radio. Some children attended public schools, others private or religious schools, depending on family means, neighbourhood, faith, and connections. French colonial influence still remained in parts of the educational world, especially in older institutions, language habits, architecture, and the prestige attached to certain forms of schooling. Vietnamese families often treated education with intense seriousness. That was not new. Learning had long been tied to family honour, mobility, discipline, and the hope that a child might step into a safer or more respected life than the parents had known. But during the war, education also carried a kind of urgency. A diploma might mean employment. Employment might mean stability. For boys, continued study could sometimes mean delay from military service, at least for a time. For girls, schooling could represent refinement, family ambition, and a possible path into teaching, office work, nursing, or other respectable employment. A school uniform was never just cloth. It was a signal that the family was still investing in tomorrow. Inside the classroom, the war did not always announce itself dramatically. It could be present in absences. An empty seat because a family had moved. A student arriving from a province where the fighting had become too dangerous. A teacher distracted because her brother was stationed somewhere she had heard mentioned on the news. A boy who had become quieter after his older cousin was killed. A girl whose family had taken in relatives and now had no quiet place for homework. The lesson might be mathematics, literature, history, French, English, civics, or science. but the room itself contained more than the lesson. It contained children who had learned to read adults. It contained teenagers who understood more politics than their parents wished. It contained students whose futures were being narrowed and widened at the same time by the war economy, foreign presence, military demands, and the instability of the Republic of Vietnam. Some wanted to study abroad. Some wanted a government job. Some wanted to avoid the army. Some wanted to join a cause. Some wanted only to pass exams and go home safely. A classroom can hold all of those ambitions at once while the teacher writes the day's exercise on the board. Education in Saigon was also political, because youth was political. University students and older high school students in South Vietnam were not silent figures waiting for adults to decide everything. They organised, debated, protested, published, marched, wrote letters, argued over peace, nationalism, corruption, American influence, communist power, military rule, and the meaning of independence. This did not mean all students agreed with one another. They did not. Some were anti-communist, some opposed the Saigon government, some opposed American involvement, some supported reform, some moved through Buddhist organizations, Catholic networks, student unions, or informal circles of friends, and many simply tried to avoid being crushed between institutions more powerful than themselves. A university student in Saigon might spend the morning in class and the afternoon in a meeting where the words spoken could bring police attention. A leaflet could be a serious object. A slogan on a wall could cause trouble. A student ID could be protection in one situation and risk in another. Youth gave energy, but it also made a person visible. For parents, this could be frightening. Imagine a father whose son is clever, restless, and angry. The father knows the government is flawed. He knows corruption exists. He knows the war has taken too much. But he also knows that arrest is real, conscription is real, police attention is real, and young men can mistake danger for purpose because danger makes them feel grown. He tells his son to study. The son says studying is useless if the country is broken. The father tells him to be careful. The son hears cowardice. The mother listens from the kitchen, pretending to rinse bowls more loudly than necessary. She does not want to crush her son's mind, but she also does not want to visit him in a prison or identify him in a hospital. This is how politics enters a family. Not always through speeches, sometimes through a young person staying out too late after a meeting, and a parent waiting by the front gate with anger ready, because anger is the only form fear can safely take. Work carried its own risks and compromises. Saigon was full of people employed by the government, by private businesses, by schools, hospitals, shops, transport services, American agencies, foreign contractors, newspapers, military supply systems, and the small, informal economy that wrapped around all of them. A government clerk might spend his day stamping forms, entering names, filing documents, and pretending that the state was more orderly than it felt. Paper mattered in South Vietnam. Identity cards, travel permits, school records, employment papers, military documents, ration forms, residence papers, letters of recommendation, certificates, receipts. A person's life could become easier or harder depending on the papers he carried and the official looking at them. Behind a desk, a clerk handled not just documents, but the nervous dependence of people who needed those documents recognised. If he was honest, he was underpaid. If he was dishonest, he might survive better. If he accepted a small gift to move a file along, was that corruption or adaptation? The answer depended on who was asking and who was hungry at home. The civil servant's day could look dull, and that dullness is important. War does not eliminate bureaucracy. In some ways, it multiplies it. More permits, more clearances, more military forms, more refugee registrations, more payroll lists, more casualty notifications, more education records disrupted by movement, more requests for exemptions, transfers, deferments, aid, compensation and proof. A ministry office could have the smell of paper, sweat, ink, cigarette smoke, and damp folders. Men in short-sleeve shirts might sit under fans with collars open slightly, trying to finish tasks before lunch, before the power failed, before a superior arrived, before a rumour changed the afternoon. Women worked in these offices too as secretaries, typists, clerks, receptionists, translators and assistants. Their work could be skilled and essential while still being treated as secondary. A woman who typed letters all day might return home and begin another shift of cooking, cleaning and family care. The office gave her wages. The home took the rest of her strength. Teachers occupied a difficult place. They carried respect, but respect did not always translate into security. A teacher had to keep order in a classroom filled with children affected by war, poverty, displacement and politics. He or she had to prepare students for exams while the country itself seemed to be failing a much larger test. Lessons in civics could be awkward when government changed through coups, constitutions, military councils, elections, crackdowns and reforms that ordinary families struggled to trust. Lessons in history could become sensitive because history was not neutral in a divided country. Even language carried choices. French had old prestige. English had new practical value because of American presence. Vietnamese carried national meaning, family feeling, and the daily reality of the classroom. A student learning English might be doing so for opportunity, not affection. A parent might encourage it because English could lead to work with Americans, a better salary, or a route out. Another parent might dislike what that implied and encourage it anyway. Work connected Saigon to the American war machine in thousands of small ways. The United States presence created jobs for translators, drivers, cleaners, clerks, construction workers, guards, mechanics, cooks, laundry workers, bar employees, office staff, and suppliers. Some Vietnamese families depended on these jobs. American pay or American-linked work could bring income that outpaced ordinary wages. That money could buy rice, medicine, school fees, a motorbike, a better fan, a safer home, or a little protection against inflation, but it could also bring judgment. Working for Americans might be seen as practical, fortunate, shameful, dangerous, or politically compromising depending on the observer. A man who drove for a foreign office might be envied by neighbours and watched by others. A woman who worked near American soldiers might earn more than her brother and face gossip for it. A family might accept money from a job they preferred not to discuss. In wartime, employment was rarely morally clean. It was attached to survival, and survival does not always ask permission from pride. The workday was filled with waiting. That may sound strange because cities are busy, and Saigon was very busy, but waiting was one of the basic activities of wartime life. People waited for buses, waited at offices, waited for papers, waited at checkpoints, waited for wages, waited for news from provinces, waited for letters from soldiers, waited for relatives to arrive, waited for curfew to lift, waited for a road to reopen, waited for an exam result, waited for a medical appointment, waited outside a government office where a clerk might or might not call their name. Waiting was not empty time. It was nervous time. It had posture. People held documents carefully. They watched the person ahead of them. They judged whether the official was in a good mood. They wondered if money would be expected. They wondered if their name had been spelled correctly. They wondered if a missing stamp would ruin the day. The line outside an office could tell you as much about the country as a speech by a president. For young men, waiting could mean waiting for the army. South Vietnam's military needs grew more intense as the war expanded, and after the shock of 1968, the government moved into broader mobilization. For families, this was not an administrative matter. It entered the house through sons. A boy could be a student one year and a soldier the next. A mother might look at a teenage son and see both the child he'd been and the uniform he might soon wear. Deferments, exemptions, medical classifications, school status, family connections, bribes, and luck could all shape what happened. Some young men served willingly, some avoided service, Some were forced in, some deserted, some returned changed, some did not return. It is important not to flatten them into one category. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam was made of real people with families, loyalties, doubts, courage, fatigue, and complicated reasons for wearing the uniform. But inside the family home, the draft was often experienced as a slow approach. Papers, notices, rumours. Advice from relatives, a friend called up, a neighbour's son sent away, a mother saving money without saying why. Work for soldiers in Saigon could look very different from combat in the countryside, but it was still shaped by war. South Vietnamese soldiers might pass through the city on leave, guard installations, report to offices, move between units, visit family, seek paperwork, or recover from wounds. A uniform in the street meant different things depending on who wore it and who was looking. To a mother it might mean pride and dread. To a shopkeeper, a possible customer or a possible problem. To a young woman, a fiancé, a brother, a stranger, or a man whose future was uncertain. To a child, uniforms might be ordinary enough to become part of the background, which is one of the quiet tragedies of a long war. Children can grow used to almost anything adults cannot stop. For women, the working day often had no clear border. A woman might sell in the market, teach school, work as a seamstress, serve in an office, run a small shop, take in laundry, prepare food for sale, manage a boarding room, or work in the entertainment districts that grew around foreign money. Then she came home to tasks that were not considered separate employment, though they consumed hours. Cooking, washing, caring for children, tending elders, stretching money, managing kin obligations, preparing offerings, maintaining respectability, and keeping track of news that might affect the household. Wartime made women's work heavier not only because prices rose and relatives arrived, but because emotional management became part of the job. Someone had to make fear livable. Someone had to tell children enough but not too much. Someone had to notice whether an old person was eating less. Someone had to remember which neighbour could be trusted, which seller gave credit, which official expected payment, which child needed shoes, which document was missing, which rumour should be ignored until confirmed. Factories and workshops added another layer to the city's labour. Saigon's economy was not only offices, markets, and American service work. There were printers, mechanics, food processors, textile workers, repair shops, carpenters, metal workers, and countless small manufacturing spaces. A young apprentice might learn to fix engines because engines were everywhere and always in need of repair. A printer might handle newspapers, school materials, business forms, political leaflets, or official documents, sometimes with more awareness than was safe. A seamstress might sew uniforms one day, and civilian clothing the next. A mechanic might repair a scooter used to take children to school, or a vehicle connected to military supply. The war blurred categories. Civilian work supported military life. Military goods entered civilian use. Civilian skills kept the wartime city moving. Lunch divided the day, but not equally for everyone. Students might return home if distance allowed or eat something near school. Office workers might eat rice, noodles, bread, or whatever could be bought nearby. Men with enough money might sit in cafes longer than necessary. Workers paid by the day might eat quickly and return before losing wages. A teacher might grade papers while eating. A secretary might run errands during the break because the family needed something before prices changed again. The midday heat made the city slower, but it did not make it still. Fans turned. People rested where they could. A child in class fought sleep. A clerk leaned back and closed his eyes for 5 minutes. A cyclo driver waited in shade. Somewhere a radio reported news that made the afternoon feel different from the morning. Waiting for news was a form of labour too. Families waited for letters from the front, from provinces, from relatives abroad, from sons studying elsewhere, from officials who had promised something. Postal delays could become emotional events. A letter written weeks earlier might arrive after the situation it described had changed completely. A family might read the same letter several times, not because it contained new information, but because the handwriting itself was proof of life at the moment it was written. If a son wrote that he was well, his mother might believe him and not believe him. Soldiers often wrote to protect families. Families often read to detect what had been omitted. A cheerful sentence could be too cheerful. A missing detail could become a worry. The paper was folded, saved, placed near other important things. In a city full of radios and rumours, a handwritten letter still had a weight no broadcast could replace. For children, the afternoon after school could feel almost normal. That is worth remembering. They might stop for snacks if they had coins. They might walk with friends, trade gossip, complain about teachers, talk about songs, films, exams, siblings, or small humiliations. They might play in alleys, help at the family shop, do homework, carry water, watch younger children, or run errands through streets they knew better than adults realised. But childhood in wartime Saigon included rules that came from danger. Come straight home, do not go that way, do not talk to strangers, keep your papers, if there is trouble, go to your aunt's house, if you hear shooting, get inside, if you are stopped, be polite, if someone asks about your father, say only this. These instructions might be given calmly because panic would frighten the child. But the calm did not make them ordinary. A child who grows up with such instructions learns that the city has invisible lines. Older students lived between dependence and adulthood. They were young enough to be scolded, old enough to be watched. They could be drawn into politics, romance, military danger, family responsibility and employment all at once. A university student might carry a book in one hand and a leaflet in the other. A young woman might attend class in the morning, help her family's business in the afternoon, and write letters at night. A young man might argue about nationalism with friends and then go home to a mother who only wanted him to keep his head down. Student life had cafes, reading circles, music, exams, flirtations, ambitions, and jokes. It also had police raids, arrests, surveillance, and the knowledge that youth movements in South Vietnam could become powerful enough to frighten authorities. The distance between a campus debate and a prison cell was not always as wide as parents hoped. The afternoon workday ended unevenly. Some offices closed. Some shops became busier as people returned home. Some workers stayed late because the day's income was not enough. Streets filled again with schoolchildren, employees, soldiers on leave, vendors adjusting to evening trade, and families trying to complete errands before curfew or before the city felt less predictable. Waiting changed shape in the late afternoon. It became domestic. Who has come home? Who is late? Did the boy leave school on time? Did the father collect his pay? Did the daughter stop at the market? Did the cousin's bus arrive from the province? Did the office release the document? Did the checkpoint delay traffic? Did something happen near the bridge? The same city that had demanded movement all day now demanded return. This return was not always smooth. A bus might be delayed, a road might be blocked, military traffic might interrupt civilian routes, rain might flood streets, police might check papers, a rumour might cause people to avoid one area and crowd another. A young man might linger with friends without understanding how fear was building at home. A worker might stop to collect money owed and find the debtor gone. A teacher might remain at school after a meeting. A clerk might be held by a superior. A student activist might not come home because he was hiding, arrested, or simply careless. For the family waiting behind a gate, all these possibilities could feel too similar until the person appeared. And when they did appear, the house resumed its breathing. One by one, people entered, removed shoes or set down bags, complained about heat, asked about food, handed over purchases, reported news, or avoided reporting news. The day's public life became family information. The teacher said students were restless. The clerk said prices would rise again. The student said police were near the campus. The driver said a road was bad. The shopkeeper said American customers were spending less or more. The mother said the market was impossible. The grandmother said she had already known things would get worse because grandmothers often claim the authority of having expected everything. The child asked whether there would be something sweet. The radio came on. The fan kept turning if the electricity held. By then, work and school had done what they always do. They had carried people away from the household and returned them with pieces of the outside world attached. A family dinner in Saigon could contain a whole map of the city without anyone unfolding one. The school brought one kind of news, the office another, the market another, the street another, the army another. Each person at the table knew a different Saigon, and together those fragments formed the family's understanding of where they lived. But understanding did not mean control. That was the hard part. They could know prices, rumours, routes, officials, school schedules, work obligations and warning signs and still be unable to predict the next day. So they waited. Not passively, not helplessly, but as people in wartime often wait while doing everything else. They waited while studying, cooking, filing papers, repairing engines, teaching lessons, carrying baskets, stamping forms, folding uniforms, counting wages and listening to the radio. Waiting was woven through the useful hours. Waiting for peace, yes, but peace was too large a thing to hold in the mind every day. More often they waited for smaller answers. A letter, a return, a payment, a notice, a safe road, a quiet night, a child's exam result, a son's leave, a price that did not rise. These small answers mattered because they were the pieces of life people could actually touch. And after the long day of school, work and waiting, Saigon did not simply go silent. It changed clothes. The same students who had sat in classrooms began to gather in cafes. The same office workers who had stamped forms wanted music, coffee, conversation, or a little room to forget the paperwork and the fear behind it. Soldiers on leave looked for company. Young women met friends where they could. Families considered whether there was money for a film, a sweet drink, a short outing, or just a walk past bright windows before the city tightened again. Pleasure in wartime was not the absence of seriousness. It was one of the ways people kept seriousness from consuming them completely. And in Saigon, that search for a little pleasure had its own streets, its own sounds, its own dangers, and its own strange honesty. Pleasure in wartime was not the absence of seriousness. It was one of the ways people kept seriousness from consuming them completely. In Saigon, this was visible in the hours after work and school, when the city did not exactly relax, because relax is too generous a word for a capital under pressure, but it loosened in certain places. Office workers stepped out of buildings with the day's papers still in their hands. Students drifted toward cafes with books under their arms. Soldiers on leave moved through the same streets with the restless look of men who had limited time and did not want to spend it thinking about where they would be sent next. Young women met friends where families considered it respectable enough, or where respectability could be negotiated. Journalists, drivers, clerks, musicians, waiters, tailors, shopkeepers and foreign personnel all entered the early evening city at different speeds. Some were looking for coffee, some for music, some for a film, some for company, some for a place to sit where the day could be spoken about without being faced too directly. The city had not become safe. It had simply reached the part of the day when people needed something more than endurance. The cafes of Saigon were not all the same. That is important. A cafe could be a small sidewalk place with low stools, strong coffee, cigarette smoke, and customers who knew each other's routines. It could be a more fashionable room where young people came because of the music, the street, the chance to be seen, and the feeling that the city still belonged to them in some small way. It could be attached to a hotel filled with foreigners, reporters, officials, and men who spoke too loudly because they assumed money gave them the right. It could be quiet enough for two people to sit over one drink longer than the owner preferred. It could be political, romantic, literary, practical, or simply convenient. Coffee had a way of making waiting look intentional. A person sitting in a cafe did not appear to be helpless. He appeared to be thinking, reading, meeting someone, watching the street, letting time pass on his own terms. In a city where so much waiting was forced, that mattered. Tudu Street, once Rue Catenay under the French, carried a particular weight in wartime Saigon. It ran through the centre of the city, from near the cathedral and official district toward the river, and its name itself, meaning freedom, had a way of sounding almost too direct for the time. Young Vietnamese gathered in coffee shops there. Foreigners passed through. Correspondents knew its hotels and bars, shops, cafes, cinemas, restaurants and offices made it one of those streets where the city performed several versions of itself at once. A student could sit near a table where a journalist was taking notes. A young couple could try to have a private conversation in a room full of people listening to everything. An American could mistake the street for entertainment, while a Vietnamese customer understood the same street as work, risk, opportunity, memory and display. This was one of Saigon's strange skills. It could put different worlds side by side and make them share the same doorway. The coffee itself was often thick, dark and slow to finish. Condensed milk softened it, but did not make it gentle. Ice, when available, made it a small luxury against the heat. A glass of iced coffee could sit on a table with water beading on the outside while fans moved smoke through the room. People smoked constantly, or at least that is how it can seem from the photographs and accounts of the period. Cigarettes belonged to the posture of the cafe. They gave the hand something to do. They made silence look deliberate. They could be local, French, American, imported, smuggled, gifted, sold or shared. A cigarette passed across a table could be friendship, flirtation, status, habit, or bribery in its smallest possible form. The cafe table gathered these small objects: coffee glass, ashtray, newspaper, notebook, matchbox, a folded letter, a book of poems, a government form, a pair of sunglasses. All of them ordinary, and each one belonging to a city where ordinary things could carry extra meaning. Music came into the cafes as a second atmosphere. It might come from a radio, a record player, a live singer, a small band, or a customer humming something under his breath because the melody had been everywhere that week. Saigon in the 1960s and early 1970s had a lively popular music world, and this can surprise people who know the war only through American songs played over helicopter footage in later films. South Vietnamese music was not a weak copy of someone else's culture. It was its own urban sound, shaped by older Vietnamese forms, French influence, American rock and soul, bolero, sentimental ballads, military songs, student songs, nightclub performance, radio, television, and the taste of young people who were living through a war but were still young. The city's music could be soft and melancholy, bright and electric, patriotic, romantic, ironic, or deeply weary. It could be a way to forget the war for 3 minutes, or a way to say what could not safely be said in direct speech. Trin Kong Son belonged to this world in a way that still matters. His songs were widely loved by many young people, and they carried a sadness that did not sound like defeat so much as recognition. He wrote about love, loss, mothers, soldiers, death, and the human cost of war with a directness that could feel intimate in a cafe room. His music did not need to shout to be political. Sometimes the refusal to shout made it more powerful. A student listening to such a song might not have had a program or a solution. He might simply have had a feeling that the adults in power had made a disaster and then asked the young to die inside it. A young woman hearing the same song might think of a brother, a lover, a classmate, a village, or herself. This is what music does under pressure. It gathers private grief into a form that can be shared without everyone explaining themselves. At the same time, not every song in Saigon was mournful. The city had dance music, rock bands, singers in fashionable clothes, electric guitars, nightclub acts, and songs meant for movement rather than reflection. American music entered through soldiers, radio, records, clubs, and the broader flow of goods that war brought with it. French songs remained familiar to many in the older urban world. Vietnamese performers adapted, translated, borrowed, transformed, and made things their own. A band playing Western-style music in Saigon was not simply proving foreign influence. It was responding to an urban audience that wanted sound large enough to match the time they were living through. Electric music made sense in a city of engines, neon signs, military vehicles, crowded cafes, and young people who had grown tired of being told to wait quietly for history to decide their lives. The presence of American soldiers changed the music economy as surely as it changed the price of imported goods. Bars and clubs serving foreign personnel needed bands. Musicians could earn money playing for Americans, and the pay could be much better than ordinary work. This created opportunity and tension at the same time. A guitarist might learn songs requested by soldiers because those songs paid. A singer might perform in English because English opened doors. A club might become known for a certain sound, a certain crowd, a certain arrangement with military customers. Vietnamese musicians were skilled and adaptable, but adaptation does not mean the situation was simple. Money from foreign soldiers could support families. It could also pull performers into spaces associated with drinking, prostitution, violence, gossip, and moral judgment. A family might be proud that a son was talented and uneasy about where he played. A young woman who sang in public could be admired and criticised by the same neighbourhood. Nightclubs were only one part of the evening city, but they are difficult to ignore because they show how pleasure and danger sat close together. In some rooms, men drank as if the night had no consequences. In others, Vietnamese and foreign customers mixed in ways that depended on money, language, desire, loneliness, and the distortions of war. The entertainment districts around American presence were not separate from ordinary Saigon. They employed local people, they raised rents, they created markets for food, laundry, transport, tailoring, music, sex, alcohol, and protection. They changed how streets felt after dark. They gave some families income and others worry. They created stories that people repeated with either envy or disgust, often both. A city at war does not divide neatly into respectable and unrespectable zones. People cross lines because wages are needed, because curiosity is strong, because youth is restless, because loneliness is common, because the future feels unreliable. It would be wrong, though, to make every evening pleasure in Saigon revolve around foreigners. Vietnamese social life had its own centre of gravity. Students met other students, families went out together, couples found places where they could speak without a dozen relatives listening. Friends sat in cafes for longer than the price of the drink justified. People discussed poetry, exams, politics, records, fashion, rumours, and film stars. A young man might save money for coffee, because being able to sit in the right place with the right friends mattered to his sense of himself. A young woman might be watched carefully by her family, and still find ways to belong to the city beyond the household. Pleasure could be modest. It might be a sweet drink, a plate of noodles after class, a song heard live, a walk past shop windows, a record played again and again, a cinema ticket paid for with money that should maybe have gone somewhere else. These things were not trivial. They were evidence that people still had preferences, tastes, crushes, ambitions, and moods that the war had not fully absorbed. Movie theatres gave Saigon another kind of escape. The city had cinemas with long histories, some dating back to the colonial period, when French-style theatres served Europeans and wealthy local audiences before becoming part of a broader urban entertainment culture. The Eden and the Majestic were remembered as among the beautiful old cinemas of central Saigon. The Rex became famous for other reasons too, including its place in the wartime world of hotels, briefings, and foreign attention, but as a cinema and public building, it also belonged to the city's entertainment landscape. There were other theatres across the city and beyond, different in size, comfort, clientele, and reputation. A cinema was not just a screen. It was a place to stand in line, read posters, meet someone, cool down if the air inside was better than at home, sit in darkness with strangers, and leave for a while. What did people watch? The answer varied. South Vietnamese audiences saw local films, French films, American films, Hong Kong films, Indian films, and other imports, depending on distribution, censorship, taste, and availability. South Vietnam's film industry produced comedies, melodramas, war stories, family tragedies, and popular films with known actors and singers. Hong Kong cinema was especially popular in the region, and its action, melodrama, stars, and commercial energy reached Vietnamese theatres. American films also had an audience, though the experience of watching American images in a country filled with American power must have felt different depending on who was in the seat. A young viewer might simply enjoy the glamour. A father might dislike the influence and still take the family because the children wanted to go. A student might watch a foreign film and feel both expanded and irritated by the distance between the screen world and the streets outside. Censorship shaped what could appear on screens. South Vietnam, like many wartime states, watched culture carefully. Films could be restricted for political reasons, moral reasons, or both. That does not mean audiences were passive. People understood censorship. They guessed at cuts. They repeated scenes. They compared foreign stars. They followed actors and singers. They judged costumes. They argued about endings. They enjoyed the forbidden feeling of certain images even when the film itself was permitted. Cinema created a public darkness very different from the darkness of curfew. Inside the theatre, darkness was chosen and shared. It allowed laughter, whispering, tears, a hand held briefly, a child leaning into a parent, a soldier sleeping through a film because he was exhausted and the seat was softer than where he usually slept. For 2 hours, the city outside did not disappear, but it waited. The theatre lobby had its own life. Posters promised drama, romance, action, comedy, and music. Vendors outside sold snacks. Young people assessed one another with the seriousness of youth everywhere. Families counted tickets. A person might choose a film because of the star, because of the air conditioning if the theatre had it, because of the neighbourhood, because of the time, because it ended before curfew became a problem, or because there was nowhere else to go. Going to the cinema required calculation in wartime. Could the family afford it? Was the route safe? Would the show end too late? Was there news of trouble in the district? If there had recently been attacks, would a crowded public place feel foolish? These questions did not always prevent people from going. They simply accompanied the decision. Pleasure had to pass through risk and come out the other side still worth it. There is something moving about people buying cinema tickets during a war. It can look careless from a distance, but it was often the opposite. It was a refusal to let life become only fear. Parents took children because children needed memories that were not all warnings. Couples went because love cannot survive entirely on promises made at gates under supervision. Students went because classrooms and politics were not enough. Soldiers went because a dark theatre gave them permission to stop being watched for a little while. A grandmother might complain about the noise and then laugh harder than anyone at a comic scene. A family might argue afterward about whether the money had been wasted, but the argument itself would become part of the outing. That is how pleasure works when it is scarce. It does not need to be perfect to matter. The music in films could leave the theatre and enter the street. A song heard in a movie might be sung afterward in a cafe. A hairstyle seen on screen might be copied. A dress might be discussed. A romantic line might become a joke between friends. Popular culture moved through Saigon in loops. Radio promoted singers. Cafes played songs. Films used music. Record shops sold what they could. Young people carried melodies into schools and offices. Soldiers heard them on leave. Families heard them through walls. The war did not stop this circulation. In some ways, it intensified it because people needed common references that were not only military. A song gave strangers something to recognise in one another. A film star gave people something to talk about besides casualty reports and prices. A cafe gave the conversation a table. Of course, not everyone approved. Older people often worried that young people were becoming too Western, too loose, too political, too careless, too loud, too attached to cafes, music, fashion and late hours. This is a very old complaint, but wartime made it sharper. A father might see his daughter listening to modern music and worry not only about taste, but about reputation and safety. A mother might see her son spending money in cafes and think of rice, school fees, and the draft. A teacher might complain that students knew song lyrics better than lessons. Religious leaders and moralists worried about nightclubs, foreign influence, sexual behaviour, drugs, prostitution, and the breakdown of discipline. Some of their fears were exaggerated, some were not. War really did loosen certain structures. It brought foreign money, displaced people, military demand, black markets, and new forms of temptation. It also made youth impatient with lectures about order from adults who had failed to provide it. The cafe was one of the places where this generational tension became visible. A young man could sit for hours discussing the war in language his parents would consider dangerous or useless. A young woman could listen to songs that gave emotional shape to feelings her family expected her to contain. Friends could build a private world at a table, with jokes, favourite singers, books, shared cigarettes, and political opinions developing faster than caution. Parents knew that cafes could be harmless and not harmless. They were places of study, flirtation, politics, idleness, art, and surveillance. A police informant could sit 2 tables away. A friend could be less trustworthy than he seemed. A song could be banned, a singer watched, a conversation repeated. Even pleasure had ears around it. Still, people went. They went because the alternative was to let the war own every room. They went because the human need for company does not become smaller when life becomes dangerous. It becomes larger. Loneliness was everywhere in wartime Saigon, though not always visible. American soldiers were lonely. South Vietnamese soldiers were lonely. Refugees were lonely in crowded houses. Students were lonely inside opinions their parents could not understand. Women working in entertainment districts were lonely in ways customers did not want to see. Fathers were lonely in their authority. Mothers were lonely in their calculations. A cafe, a song, or a film could not cure that loneliness, but it could interrupt it. Sometimes interruption is enough to get someone through another day. The city's pleasures also had schedules shaped by curfew. Evening could not stretch indefinitely for everyone. The approach of curfew changed the mood of a street. People who had been lingering began to check the time. A family at the cinema calculated how long the trip home would take. A cafe owner watched the door. A young couple had to end a conversation before it had reached what they wanted to say. Soldiers and police became more visible. Traffic shifted. The same city that had allowed laughter and music began to remind everyone that permission was temporary. This did not make the laughter false. It made it more aware of itself. If you had walked past a cafe in those hours, you might have heard a love song through the open front, the scrape of chairs, cups set down, someone laughing at a joke, someone arguing politics in a voice too intense for the table, someone telling him to lower it, a motorbike outside, a vendor passing, and the radio from another room carrying news no one could fully ignore. If you had walked past a cinema, you might have seen posters under lights, young people gathered outside, soldiers smoking, a mother adjusting a child's shirt, a man selling snacks, and the ordinary impatience of people waiting for doors to open. If you had looked carefully, you would also have seen the other layer. The glance toward the street, the awareness of time, the calculation of distance home, the knowledge that a public place could become dangerous without warning. The city had not forgotten the war. It had simply made a little room beside it. This is the strange persistence of pleasure in wartime Saigon. It was not denial, at least not only denial. It was maintenance. People maintained appetite, style, conversation, music, courtship, jokes, cinema habits, favourite singers, favourite cafes, and favourite seats, because these things help to preserve the self. A person who only survives can begin to feel less like a person. A person who chooses a song, buys a ticket, meets a friend, argues about a film, saves for coffee, or dresses carefully before going out is doing more than passing time. He or she is insisting, in a small and ordinary way, that life still contains preference. War reduces people to categories whenever it can. Soldier, refugee, civilian, collaborator, enemy, victim, official, dependent, missing, dead. Everyday pleasure pushes back by making people specific again. As the evening deepened, the lights of Saigon did not mean the same thing in every district. Some streets were bright with commerce and foreign money. Some homes had one lamp and a radio turned low. Some cafes were still full. Some mothers were already angry because a son had not come home. Some theatres were letting audiences out into air that felt warmer than the dark room they had just left. Music followed people into the street for a moment and then faded behind traffic. The same city that had offered coffee, songs and moving pictures began to narrow its choices. The hour mattered now. Roads that felt normal in daylight became more serious. Papers had to be carried. Gates had to be closed. A good evening still had to end with everyone safely inside. And so the pleasure of Saigon's cafes and cinemas moved toward the next part of the night, when the city's public life thinned. The checkpoints became more important, and ordinary families began listening again for the sounds that told them whether the dark would remain only dark. The city had not forgotten the war. It had simply made a little room beside it, and as the evening moved on, that room began to close. Saigon, after dark, was never only one thing. It was not a city that simply switched from noise to silence, or from pleasure to fear, or from movement to stillness. It changed by degrees. A cafe that had been loud an hour earlier grew more watchful. A cinema lobby emptied faster than it might have in another decade. A vendor who had hoped for a few more customers began packing before the last possible minute, because the last possible minute was dangerous. A family that had allowed a young person to go out now began counting the time with greater attention. The clock mattered in a way it does not matter in a peaceful city. It mattered not because people were sentimental about bedtime, but because after a certain hour the street belonged to different rules. Curfew was one of those rules, but the word itself can sound too clean. It makes the whole thing feel administrative, like a line printed on a notice. In reality, curfew was a feeling that entered the body. It made people walk faster. It shortened conversations. It turned a pleasant evening into a calculation. How far is home? Which road is safer? Will there be a checkpoint near the bridge? Are papers in the pocket? Is there enough time to stop for one more errand? Should the children be sent ahead? Should someone sleep at a relative's house rather than risk the road? During different phases of the war, curfew hours in Saigon changed according to security conditions, political crisis, attacks, demonstrations, and government decisions. Sometimes the city had more room to breathe, sometimes it had much less. After major shocks, especially when fighting or fear of infiltration reached the capital, the night could be cut sharply by official order. What mattered to ordinary residents was not only the exact hour, it was the knowledge that the state had claimed the darkness. To understand this properly, you have to picture the city in the hour before curfew, not the full night yet, not the empty street yet, the in-between. Shops pull in merchandise from the sidewalk. Metal gates rattle down. A woman folds fabric and slides it away from dust. A coffee seller counts glasses quickly, rinsing them with less care than she used in the afternoon. Someone argues about whether there is time to buy cigarettes. A mother tells a child to stop looking at a toy and walk. A cyclo driver decides whether one more fare is worth the risk of being caught too far from his own district. A soldier on leave checks his watch and feels the unfairness of time more sharply than a civilian might, because leave always ends too soon, even without a curfew. The city is still moving, but the movement has changed. It has lost its looseness. Everyone is aware of the narrowing. Checkpoints were part of that narrowing. They could appear at major intersections, near bridges, around government buildings, near military installations, near police posts. near areas considered vulnerable, or wherever authorities believed movement needed to be controlled. A checkpoint could be routine, irritating, frightening, or dangerous depending on the hour, the mood of the men posted there, the papers carried by the person stopped, the recent news, and the 1,000 small accidents that shape encounters between civilians and armed authority. A person approaching one didn't only see sandbags and uniforms, he saw possibilities, delay, questioning, a bribe, a search, a misunderstanding, a young soldier too nervous, an officer too suspicious, a document with the wrong stamp, a name that sounded like another name, a relative's address in a district that raised questions. In wartime, paperwork became a kind of portable skin. It proved who you were, or failed to. The identity card was not just a card. It was protection, vulnerability, an explanation folded into one object. People carried papers because movement required them. Students had school identification. Workers had employment documents. Soldiers had military papers. Refugees had whatever they had been able to secure. Men of draft age carried a special tension with them because their bodies were politically meaningful. A young man stopped at night might be asked not only where he was going, but why he was not somewhere else, why he was not in uniform, what he studied, who his father was, where he lived, whether his papers were current. A young woman might be questioned differently, but not necessarily gently. Older people might be treated with respect or impatience depending on the checkpoint. Children might be sleepy and frightened, not understanding why adults suddenly spoke in careful voices. That careful voice is one of the sounds of curfew. People do not always become silent around authority. Sometimes they become polite in a very specific way. Not warm, not submissive exactly, practical. A father answering questions at a checkpoint might keep his tone level so his children did not panic. A driver might joke lightly if he knew the soldier, or stay formal if he did not. A woman might explain that she was returning from a sick relative, whether the relative was sick or not, because some explanation sounded more acceptable than others. A soldier might wave someone through without interest. Another might inspect every face in the vehicle. A family could pass without trouble 9 times and still fear the 10th, because the 10th is the one that stays in memory. The city's roads after dark were shaped by bridges. Saigon was a city of waterways, canals and connections, and bridges mattered for traffic, trade, military movement and security. In daylight they could be busy crossings. At night they could feel exposed. A bridge is a place where a person cannot easily turn aside. It channels movement into one path, and that makes it useful to police and dangerous to anyone who wants to avoid attention. People knew which crossings were likely to be watched. They knew which areas felt tense. They knew when to avoid a route because someone had heard something. This knowledge was not always written down or spoken clearly. It travelled through neighbours, drivers, vendors, students, soldiers, and relatives. A city under curfew develops a second map, one made not of street names but of caution. Sirens could cut through that map. The sound of a siren in wartime has a way of entering the room before people have decided what it means. It might be an air raid warning, a police vehicle, an ambulance, a military alert, a fire, a response to an explosion, or simply one more official sound in a city full of official sounds. But the body reacts before the mind sorts the categories. Conversations pause. A child looks up. A mother listens for whether the sound is approaching or passing away. A father turns down the radio or turns it up depending on his habits. Someone steps toward the doorway and is told not to. Dogs begin barking. A neighbour calls out. In some neighbourhoods, people learn to distinguish sounds with almost expert precision. Mortars, small arms fire, fireworks, thunder, engine backfire, military vehicles, helicopters, sirens, distant explosions. This was not knowledge anyone wanted, but the city taught it anyway. During periods of attack or heightened alert, the night could become a series of interruptions. Saigon was not bombed in the way some cities in the 20th century were bombed, with whole districts routinely flattened from the air, but it was not removed from violence. There were terrorist bombings, sapper attacks, rockets, mortar fire, firefights, assassinations, raids, and moments when the war entered the capital with shocking clarity. The Tet Offensive in 1968 changed how many residents understood the night. Fighting in and around Saigon, attacks on symbolic and strategic sites, and the realization that the enemy could penetrate the city made the idea of security feel less stable. After such events, ordinary sounds could carry the memory of extraordinary ones. A gate slammed too hard, a vehicle stopped outside too long, a burst of noise came from the wrong direction. People did not necessarily run every time. They could not live that way. But they listened. Inside the home, curfew did not mean rest. It meant enclosure. The family might be together, but togetherness under curfew was not always comforting. The gate had been pulled shut. The street beyond it was thinner now. Fewer footsteps, fewer vendors, fewer engines, more gaps between sounds. The fan turned if there was power. The radio stayed close. In many homes, people did not leave the radio on loudly after dark, especially if the news was grim or the neighbours too near. Sound travelled through walls, courtyards, vents, and open windows. A political opinion said carelessly could go farther than intended. A family might listen to the official news, foreign broadcasts, music, or nothing, depending on habit and caution. There were evenings when silence felt safer than information, and evenings when not knowing felt worse. Candles appeared when the lights failed or when electricity was rationed, unreliable or interrupted. Candlelight in a Saigon home during the war was not the same as the soft decorative candlelight people choose today. It was a substitute, a signal of failure somewhere in the system, and a practical tool that had to be used carefully. A candle on a table could let children finish homework. It could let a mother continue sewing. It could allow a family to eat without spilling soup. It could make the altar glow in a way that felt older than the city's electrical wires. But it also reminded everyone that the house depended on fragile things. A blackout made the home smaller. Corners disappeared. Faces were lit from below. The fan stopped, and the heat returned immediately. Mosquitoes became more noticeable. The radio, if battery-powered, became more precious. A child asked when the lights would come back, and an adult answered with confidence nobody had earned. Blackouts did not have to be total to change the mood. Even a dimming of power could make people look up. The moment a fan slowed, the household knew. The moment a lamp flickered, conversation altered. If lights went out across a neighbourhood, people might step toward doors and windows, not outside fully if curfew made that unwise, but close enough to see whether others had lost power too. A shared blackout created a strange intimacy among houses. The alley breathed differently. Someone cursed. Someone laughed. Someone lit a lamp. A baby began crying. A grandmother said the old ways were more reliable, though she probably preferred the fan as much as anyone. The city had modern systems, but the home kept older tools ready because wartime modernity could not be trusted to stay modern all night. Candles also belonged to prayer and the altar, and this gave night another layer. A family might light incense before sleep. A Catholic household might pray the rosary. A Buddhist family might make offerings or recite quietly. Ancestor rituals continued. Religion in Saigon was varied and deeply woven into social life. Buddhism, Catholicism, Cao Dai, Hua Hao, ancestor veneration, local practices and family customs existed beside one another in the city's daily world. The war sharpened prayer because uncertainty sharpened need. A mother could pray for a son in the army. A father could pray without admitting fear. A child could repeat words he only partly understood. A grandmother could speak to the dead as if the living had become too unreliable. The candle in that moment was not only light, it was attention given shape. There were households where the evening prayer was interrupted by official noise, a siren, a truck, a knock. The knock after curfew was one of the most serious sounds a family could hear. In an ordinary city, a late knock might be annoying. In wartime Saigon, it could be a neighbour needing help, a relative caught outside, a messenger, police, soldiers, someone fleeing trouble, someone bringing news, or someone creating it. Families did not open immediately unless they recognised the voice. A pause formed inside the room. Eyes moved toward the father, or toward the person considered most capable of dealing with whoever stood outside. The children were told to stay back. A lamp might be shielded. The person at the door might whisper a name. The gate might open only a little. Nothing in that moment was theatrical to the people living it. It was procedure. It was how the home protected itself. Not all danger came from the state or the war's armed sides. Curfew also changed the city's ordinary risks. Thieves, desperate people, and opportunists existed as they do in any city, and wartime made desperation more common. A quiet street could be safer in one sense and more dangerous in another. Shops locked carefully. Families checked gates. Valuable goods were brought inside. A bicycle left out overnight could vanish. A motorbike was guarded with attention. A small store owner might sleep near the front of the house because the front was also the business. The family's livelihood could be stacked within reach of a locked gate, and every sound from the street mattered more because loss was harder to replace. A city under curfew did not eliminate crime. It altered its rhythm. For those still outside, the night could be humiliating. A person caught after curfew might have a good reason, but reasons had to be believed by someone with authority. A worker delayed by an employer, a student held after a meeting, a woman returning from a sick relative, a doctor or midwife, a driver, a soldier, a journalist, a vendor who misjudged time. All could find themselves explaining movement when movement itself had become suspicious. Some people had passes, some knew whom to pay, some relied on confidence, some relied on luck. Others avoided any risk and stayed where they were, sleeping in offices, shops, relatives' homes, or wherever curfew found them. This too affected family life. A father not returning might be safe but stuck. A son not returning might be detained, hiding, careless, or dead. Until the reason was known, the household lived through all possibilities at once. American personnel experienced Saigon's night differently from Vietnamese residents, though they too encountered restrictions, dangers, and rules. Some moved through guarded spaces, hotels, bases, clubs, billets, or official quarters with protections unavailable to most civilians. Others were vulnerable in ways they did not always understand. The city's night entertainment, military curfews, terrorist risks, military police, and official warnings shaped their evenings. But the difference in power and mobility was real. A foreigner might experience curfew as an inconvenience imposed on a tour of duty. A Vietnamese family experienced it as one more layer in a life that had no rotation date. The war was not something they were posted to. It was where they lived. The contrast could be sharp. On one rooftop, a foreign correspondent or official might drink and look out over the darkened city, thinking about strategy, danger, and the strange comfort of being able to leave someday. In a narrow house several streets away, a family might be counting whether all members were inside. Both were in Saigon. They were not in the same war. That is one of the difficult truths of wartime cities. People share geography without sharing vulnerability. A curfew line printed by the government applies to the city, but its weight falls unevenly. The poor lose evening work. Vendors lose customers. Students lose meeting time. Families lose flexibility. The connected obtain passes. The wealthy arrange transport. The desperate risk the street anyway. For the average household, curfew shortened the economy of night. In a city where inflation forced people to seek extra income, losing evening hours could hurt badly. A man who might have taken a second job after dark could no longer do so safely or legally. A woman who sold food in the evening lost customers. A porter, driver, musician, waiter, bar employee, or street vendor saw the usable day shrink. This is why security measures often punish the very people they claim to protect. The curfew might make infiltration harder, or appear to. It also made ordinary survival harder. When historians write about state control, it can sound like policy. In the home, it sounded like less money. Children understood curfew in their own way. They might know that after a certain hour the street was forbidden, but not grasp all the reasons. For younger children, curfew could make the outside seem more frightening than it had been in daylight. The same alley where they played now belonged to adults, soldiers, ghosts, thieves, and whatever imagination added to official fear. If the power went out and the adults spoke quietly, a child's mind filled in the blanks. Older children might resent curfew because it confined them, limited friendships, interrupted courtship, ended games, and made them feel watched. Teenagers in every time and place push against boundaries, but in wartime Saigon pushing could carry consequences their parents could not soften afterward. A daughter late past curfew frightened a household for safety and reputation at once. A son late past curfew frightened them for reasons too numerous to list calmly. The night also changed how people heard the war at a distance. In daytime, the city's ordinary noise swallowed many things. Engines, markets, radios, voices, construction, traffic, schoolyards, and street vendors made a thick layer of sound. After curfew, when civilian movement thinned, distant military sounds could travel differently. Helicopters, artillery far off, gunfire if close enough. Explosions whose meaning depended on direction and repetition. A family might pause and count seconds, not always consciously. Was it one sound or many? Was it moving closer? Did the dogs react? Did neighbours open doors? Did the radio interrupt? The difference between staying in bed and moving children to a safer place could depend on such judgments. People became students of sound because the night required it. And yet, even under curfew, people slept. This may seem obvious, but it matters. They slept because bodies demand surrender. They slept in heat, in worry, near candles burned low, near radios, near documents, under mosquito nets, beside children who turned in their sleep, beneath roofs that held the day's warmth long after sunset. Some slept lightly, some slept deeply from exhaustion. A mother who had waited for everyone to come home might be the last to lie down and the first to wake. A father might wake at a sound and remain still, listening without wanting to alarm anyone. A grandmother might murmur a prayer without fully waking. A child might dream of school, not war. The city held its breath, but human lungs cannot hold breath forever. Life insisted on unconsciousness even when caution argued against it. There is something almost unbearably human in that. A city can be placed under curfew, but sleep still arrives unevenly, personally. The government can regulate movement, but not dreams. Soldiers can stand at checkpoints, but not inside every memory. Sirens can wake a neighbourhood, but after they pass, someone has to decide whether to relight the candle, whether to comfort the child, whether to check the gate, whether to save the battery, whether to lie back down and hope the next sound is ordinary. Wartime nights are made of these decisions. They are not always heroic. They are often small, repetitive and tired. That does not make them less important. Near the end of the night, before dawn, the curfew began to loosen, officially or informally depending on the day. The city did not spring awake at once. It tested itself again, as it had the morning before. A first bicycle, a gate opened carefully, a vendor preparing food, a soldier shifting at a post, a family discovering that someone had slept badly but was safe. The candle had burned down. The fan might begin again if power returned. The radio would soon bring new information, or the same information in a new tone. The market basket waited. The school uniform waited. The office papers waited. Curfew had not ended the war. It had only carried the city through another night, but some nights left traces. A late return that became a family story. A search that frightened children. A siren that taught a household where to shelter. a blackout that made neighbours speak through walls, a checkpoint humiliation that hardened a young man's politics, a candlelit prayer after bad news, a mother standing at the gate longer than she admitted. These traces accumulated inside people. They became the private archive of wartime Saigon, stored not in government files but in the body. The shoulders tightening at a siren years later, the habit of keeping documents together, the dislike of dark streets, the memory of a city going quiet before it wanted to, the knowledge that home was not truly safe, only safer than the street. And as the night thinned toward morning, the city remained full of rooms where people had carried more than they said. In those rooms were families who had learned to live by clocks, papers, prayers, market prices, rumours, and the sound of engines after dark. They had learned how to move, how to stop, how to listen, how to lower their voices, how to keep children calm, how to save candles, how to return before the street changed ownership. The curfew did not define their lives completely, but it shaped the edge of every evening. It reminded them that the war was not only something happening beyond the city. It was in the hour they had to be home, it was in the checkpoint questions, it was in the radio left low, it was in the candle held near a child's notebook, it was in the silence after the last gate closed. By the time morning returned, the city could almost pretend again. Vendors would lift pot lids, students would smooth uniforms, cyclo drivers would look for fares, cafes would open, markets would argue over prices, offices would stamp papers. The ordinary machinery would begin again, and for a few hours the night might seem like something passed through rather than something survived. But inside the homes of Saigon, the memory of those nights remained near the surface. Every family had its own way of carrying them. Some carried them in silence, some in jokes, some in caution, some in prayers, some in the decision to keep a packed bag where it could be reached. And as the war moved closer to its final years, those private habits of readiness began to matter more, because the city's families were not only learning how to get through another night, they were beginning, whether they admitted it or not, to wonder what they would take with them if the night did not end the way it usually did. They were beginning, whether they admitted it or not, to wonder what they would take with them if the night did not end the way it usually did. At first, this question did not always look like panic. It looked like tidying. It looked like a mother folding documents into a cloth packet and placing them where she could reach them quickly. It looked like a father checking the family's identity papers again, even though he had checked them the day before. It looked like a grandmother wrapping photographs in plastic against the damp. It looked like a teenage daughter noticing which jewellery her mother had stopped wearing and started hiding. It looked like a small bag near the back of a cabinet, not openly called an emergency bag because naming it would make everyone in the house too quiet. This was one of the ways the end approached Saigon, not only through armies, roads, radio announcements, and foreign evacuation plans, but through drawers being reorganised inside ordinary homes. By early 1975, Saigon's families had already lived through years of uncertainty, but uncertainty is not always the same thing as collapse. People can live a long time with danger when danger becomes routine. They can learn the patterns of curfew, prices, rumours, and distant fighting. They can become tired without becoming surprised. But the spring of 1975 had a different quality. News from the provinces began to arrive too quickly and too badly. Places that had seemed fixed on the map were no longer fixed. Families with relatives in central Vietnam, in the highlands, along roads, near military zones, or in towns tied to the retreat of the South Vietnamese army, heard stories that did not fit the old rhythm of the war. A battle lost here, a district abandoned there, a road crowded with refugees, a city falling, a relative missing, a bus route impossible, a letter that would not arrive because the address no longer meant what it had meant last month. Saigon had absorbed bad news before. This was different because the bad news was moving toward the city. There is a particular kind of listening that happens in a capital when the outer parts of a country begin to fail. People listen for geography, The names of towns become measurements of time. How far is it from there to here? How long would the road take? Who is between them and us? Can the army hold? Is this temporary? Is this another crisis that will pass? Or is this the crisis that ends all the others? The radio carried official statements, but official statements had to compete with what people heard from bus stations, military families, market sellers, civil servants, foreign offices, and refugees arriving with dust still in their clothing. A man might say confidently at breakfast that Saigon would hold. By evening he might ask quietly whether anyone knew someone with access to exit papers. Confidence and fear could live in the same person and take turns speaking. Inside the family home, the question of leaving was not simple. Leaving where? With whose permission? With what money? Through which office? On which plane, ship, road, or rumour? And who would be allowed to go? A family is rarely one neat unit in a crisis. It is a web of obligations. Parents, children, grandparents, cousins, in-laws, employees, neighbours, sons in uniform, daughters married into other households, relatives from the countryside already sleeping on the floor, someone sick, someone too old to travel, someone with no papers, someone whose work for the government or Americans might make staying dangerous, someone who refuses to leave because the ancestors are buried here, someone who says leaving is betrayal, someone who says staying is foolish, someone who says nothing because every option sounds impossible. This is why the quiet rooms mattered. The largest historical decisions of those weeks were discussed by governments and armies, but the most painful decisions were made in crowded homes with too little privacy and too many people to save. What did families carry? The answer begins with paper. Paper was proof. Identity cards, birth certificates, marriage certificates, baptismal records for Catholic families, school records, military papers, employment letters, property papers, letters of recommendation, old French documents, Vietnamese government forms, American office passes, photographs attached to applications, addresses of relatives abroad, scraps of paper with phone numbers, names of sponsors, names of officials, names of people who might be able to help. In normal life, such papers sat in drawers and waited. In April 1975, they became urgent. A document could mean a place on a list. A missing stamp could mean no list. A letter from an American employer could mean the difference between being considered at risk and being considered one more desperate person at a gate. People who had spent years complaining about bureaucracy now found themselves praying that bureaucracy would recognize them one last time. Documents were folded into envelopes, plastic sleeves, cloth packets, school bags, purses, and shirt pockets. Some people carried them close to the body because theft was possible and loss was unthinkable. Others made copies if copies could still be made. A family might argue over whether to bring property deeds. What use was a deed if the country changed? What use was not bringing it if someday proof mattered again? A diploma might seem useless in a crowd, but a mother might insist on packing it because she had not spent years paying school fees for that paper to be left behind. Military papers could protect or endanger depending on who saw them. Photographs could prove relationships or expose connections. A person preparing to leave had to think not only about what would be needed, but what could become dangerous in the wrong hands. Then there were photographs, and photographs were harder. A document proved something to an official. A photograph proved something to the heart. Studio portraits, wedding pictures, school photographs, a son in uniform, a father before his hair turned white, a mother as a young woman, children sitting stiffly in clothes they did not like, grandparents already gone, a family gathered for Tet, a house in a province the family might never see again, a baby picture of someone now old enough to fight. Photographs were light to carry until there were too many of them. Then choice entered. Which faces come? Which stay? A woman might take photographs from frames and leave the frames behind. A child might not understand why the glass was being removed. A grandmother might insist on one picture because the person in it had no grave nearby. There are decisions that take only seconds and remain painful for decades. Gold was another thing families thought about, if they had any. In Vietnam, as in many places where currency could not always be trusted, gold had long been a form of portable security. Small bars, jewellery, rings, chains, coins, anything that could hold value when paper money failed. The wartime economy had already taught families not to trust prices, wages, or official stability too completely. By the final weeks, money became a question with a short life. Piasters could buy things until they could not. Dollars had power if one could access them. Gold could be hidden, sewn, worn, traded, used to pay for passage, used to bribe, used to begin again somewhere else, or stolen before any of that happened. A mother might wear jewellery under plain clothes. A father might divide valuables among family members so one loss would not mean losing everything. A ring might hold not romance in that moment, but escape. Food and medicine entered the bags next, but only a little. People imagine fleeing with trunks, but crisis reduces belongings brutally. A family leaving by road, crowd, aircraft, or boat could not carry a pantry. Rice was heavy, water was heavy, water. Medicine was small and therefore precious. A bottle of pills for an elder, fever medicine for a child, bandages, a little dried food, milk powder if there was a baby, a spoon, a cup, something wrapped in paper because there had been no proper container. A mother might pack food not because she knew the journey, but because she did not. That is the logic of flight. You prepare for the unknown with objects designed for ordinary needs. A child will be hungry. Someone will need water. Someone will get sick. Someone will cry. The world may be ending in political terms, but a baby still needs to be fed on schedule. Clothing was chosen for movement, not memory, though memory often tried to force its way in. Simple clothes, dark clothes, clothes that did not attract attention. Something for rain, something for a child to change into if possible. A school uniform might be packed because it was clean and because the child had little else. A father might bring an extra shirt and leave a suit. A young woman might be told not to dress too finely. Shoes mattered more than almost anything. A person could lose money, papers, or pride. But if shoes failed in a crowd, the body itself became vulnerable. Sandals, leather shoes, children's shoes, shoes too tight because the child had grown, shoes saved for special occasions now used because there might be no other occasion. Families that had spent years trying to keep good things for the proper time suddenly discovered that the proper time had arrived as emergency. Not every family packed because not every family expected to leave. Some did not believe the city would fall. Some believed it might fall, but that ordinary people would be allowed to continue if they kept quiet. Some had no connection to the Americans or the South Vietnamese state strong enough to place them in immediate danger. Some had deep roots, old parents, no money, no exit route, or a moral refusal to abandon the house. Some had already fled once from the countryside and could not bear the idea of beginning again. Some waited too long because the human mind protects itself from final decisions. Until the last days, life still contained errands. Shops still opened. Meals were cooked. People still washed clothes, though perhaps with less attention. Families still argued about small things. This is not foolishness. It is how people live near endings. The ordinary does not stop in respect for history. It keeps making demands until history physically prevents it. The closer the war came, the more the city filled with people trying to solve problems too large for individuals. Lines formed near embassies, offices, military facilities, travel agencies, and places rumoured to be connected to evacuation. Rumour became a transportation system of its own. A list is being made, a plane is leaving, dependents can go, only employees can go, bring photographs, do not bring luggage, report tomorrow, report tonight. The offices closed, the gate has moved, The Americans will take their staff. The Americans will not take everyone. A ship is available. A road is open. A road is cut. The airport is still working. The airport is finished. Each rumour required a decision, and decisions required energy people no longer had. A person could spend a whole day chasing one possibility and return home with nothing but another instruction. Tan Son Nhut Airport became a place of hope and terror. For years it had been one of the busiest military and civilian airfields in the world, a place through which soldiers, officials, supplies, journalists, contractors, refugees, and letters of war passed. In the final days, it became something more desperate. Families who believed they had a chance to leave watched the airport as if it were the last open door in the country. But an airport is not a door for everyone. It has gates, runways, documents, guards, lists, aircraft, priorities and limits. When shelling and attacks made fixed-wing evacuation impossible, that hope narrowed further. The final American evacuation by helicopter on April 29th and 30th, 1975, was dramatic from a distance, but for families on the ground, drama was not the point. The point was whether a name was on a list, whether a gate opened, whether a child could be lifted through a crowd, whether someone was left behind. The famous signal, the playing of White Christmas over Armed Forces radio, belonged to that final American evacuation. But most Saigon families did not experience the end as a clean signal in a film. They experienced confusion. Some people knew exactly what the song meant. Others heard only another strange piece of information in a city already overloaded with signals. Helicopters flew overhead. Crowds gathered outside the American embassy and other evacuation points. People pressed toward walls, gates, rooftops, and compounds. Some carried bags, some carried children. Some carried nothing because they had been told there would be no room. Some had worked for American agencies for years and still could not get inside. Some had connections and succeeded. Some had promises and did not. Some families divided at the gate because one person's paperwork worked and another's did not. The moral weight of those moments cannot be softened. A crisis makes administrators out of fate. Inside homes, the final waiting had a different sound. Less argument sometimes, more listening. A family might keep the radio on constantly. A mother might cook without knowing how many people would be there to eat. A father might go out to check on a possibility and not return for hours. A son in uniform might appear suddenly, exhausted, carrying a weapon or no weapon, with a decision to make before anyone could even ask whether he had eaten. A neighbour might come in crying. Another might come in with news that turned out to be wrong. Someone might burn papers in a courtyard or kitchen stove. Someone might hide a uniform. Someone might remove photographs from the wall if they showed the wrong connection. Someone might decide that the family should say a relative had never worked where he worked. Survival can require editing one's own life quickly and without witnesses. Burning papers was one of the most painful household acts of those days. Not all papers, of course. Some were too necessary. But papers that tied a person to the South Vietnamese military, police, government, foreign organizations, political groups, or American offices could become dangerous. A certificate that had once brought pride could become evidence. A photograph that had once belonged on the wall could become a risk. A uniform carefully kept could become something to hide under either cloth or destroy. This is one of the cruelest parts of regime collapse. It forces people to sort their past into what can be admitted and what must vanish. A man might burn documents that represented years of work. A woman might watch him do it and understand that the burning was not only practical, it was a kind of mourning. For children, the final days were confusing because adults were both busy and evasive. A child might be told to pack, then unpack, then be quiet, then hurry, then wait. He might be told not to ask questions. He might see his mother crying over photographs and be told she was tired. He might hear the word re-education without understanding it. He might hear that the city would be fine. then hear that they had to leave immediately. Children notice contradiction even when they cannot interpret it. Some remembered the helicopters, some remembered crowds, some remembered a lost shoe, some remembered being hungry, some remembered an adult's hand gripping theirs too tightly, some remembered being told to carry a younger sibling and not let go. Historical memory often enters children through physical details, because the political explanation comes later. Not everyone went toward evacuation points. Many families stayed inside and waited for the new authorities. For them, the question was not what to carry out, but what to keep hidden, what to say, how to behave, how to protect sons, how to explain past employment, how to avoid being denounced by a neighbour, how to make the house look ordinary enough. The last quiet rooms were full of this kind of preparation too. A family might take down certain pictures. A father might tell children to say nothing about an uncle. A mother might move valuables. A soldier might change clothes. A civil servant might rehearse a harmless version of his work. A Catholic family, a Buddhist family, a Chinese merchant family, a military family, a refugee family, each had different fears. The end of the war did not arrive as one emotion. It arrived as many private calculations under one public event. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks entered the Independence Palace, and the South Vietnamese government surrendered. That sentence is historically necessary, but it is too large to contain what happened in homes. A government can surrender in a broadcast. A family still has to decide whether to open the gate. A city can be renamed in time. A woman still has to find rice. A flag can change above an official building. A child still has to ask whether school will happen. A soldier can be ordered to report. His mother still has to look at his face while he decides what obedience means now. The fall of a capital is both an event and a series of ordinary actions that suddenly take place under new meaning. The first hours after the fall were not the same for everyone. Some felt relief that the shooting might stop. Some felt terror. Some felt humiliation. Some felt anger. Some felt numbness. Some had supported the other side quietly and now spoke differently. Some had no politics left, only exhaustion. Shops did not all open at once. Streets didn't all empty. People watched the behaviour of soldiers entering the city. They watched neighbours. They watched who took down signs, who put up new ones, who smiled too early, who kept their face blank. A blank face can be a form of intelligence. Many Saigon residents had spent years learning when to speak and when not to. After the fall, that knowledge became useful in a new way. Inside the rooms we have been visiting all along, the objects remained, but their meanings shifted. The radio now carried different voices. The documents in the drawer had different risks. The altar still held the dead, who had seen governments come and go before. The fan still mattered in the heat. The rice still had to be cooked. The market would reopen because the city had to eat. The photographs hidden away still existed, even if they could not be displayed. A school book on the table still belonged to a child who needed a future, though the curriculum might change. A candle still gave light when power failed. Ordinary objects are stubborn. They do not understand surrender ceremonies. They continue to require use. For those who left, what they carried became the first archive of exile. A packet of documents, a few photographs, gold hidden in clothing, a rosary, a small Buddha image, a letter, a school certificate, a child's clothing, a family address book, medicine, a ring, a memory of the house left locked or unlocked, a memory of the altar, a memory of whether incense had been lit before leaving, refugees who departed by aircraft, helicopter, ship, fishing boat, or later overland and by sea, carried these things into camps, sponsor homes, new countries, and new languages. Some objects survived, some were lost, some were sold because survival required it. Some sat in drawers for decades and became painful to touch. To an outsider, a photograph is a photograph. To the person who carried it through the end of a country, it is evidence that life existed before the emergency. For those who stayed, carrying looked different. They carried knowledge quietly. Which relative had served where? Which neighbour had helped? Which neighbour had denounced? Which papers had been burned? Which valuables were hidden? Which words were no longer safe? Which memories could be told to children and which had to wait? Many former South Vietnamese soldiers, officials and others connected to the old regime were sent to re-education camps. Families waited again, as they had waited through the war, but under changed circumstances, waiting for release, waiting for permission, waiting for letters, waiting for economic changes, waiting for news from someone who had left, waiting for the city to become familiar again, under a new name and a new order. The war had ended, but endings do not automatically produce rest. This is why the last quiet rooms matter. They help us see the end of Saigon not only as a collapse seen from rooftops and embassy gates, but as a household experience. The great images are real. Helicopters, crowds, tanks, the palace gates, the evacuation fleet offshore. But history also happened in the room where a mother chose photographs, where a father burned papers, where a child was told to carry only one toy, where a grandmother refused to leave the altar, where a son hid his uniform, where a family ate a meal without knowing whether it would be the last one in that house. These scenes were not photographed as often. They do not fit easily into timelines, but they are where the fall of Saigon became intimate, and perhaps that is the thing to hold on to as we step back from this city. Everyday life in wartime Saigon was not small because it was ordinary. It was ordinary because people kept doing it under conditions that made ordinary life difficult. They bought rice. They stretched fish sauce. They sent children to school. They waited at checkpoints. They drank coffee. They listened to music. They went to films. They prayed at altars. They locked gates before curfew. They packed bags without admitting they were bags for leaving. They carried documents, photographs, gold, medicine and stories. Some carried them out of the country. Some carried them into the years that followed. Some carried them silently for the rest of their lives. Tonight, when you look around your own room, notice what you would reach for first if you had only a little time. Not because you expect to leave, but because the question reveals what a home really is. It is not only walls, furniture, and routines. It is proof, memory, duty, comfort, fear, and the people whose names are attached to everything inside it. For Saigon's families in the final days of the war, the home became a place of sorting. What can be carried? What must be hidden? What has to be left? What cannot be replaced? And when the city changed around them, those choices went with them, into exile, into silence, into new lives, into old grief, into family stories told years later at kitchen tables far from the streets where they began. The gates closed, the radio spoke, the candles burned low, and in rooms all across Saigon, ordinary people did what ordinary people have always done when history comes too close. They held on to what they could, protected whom they could, and stepped into the next morning carrying more than anyone else could see.